When a billionaire builds an empire on the blood and bones of trafficked children, does he have a chance at redemption? Kieran Valecroft has it all: skyscrapers, political power, and a past buried beneath a layer of opulent concrete. But tonight, his maid lies dead in his own kitchen, and the letter left beside her body will expose the crimes he thought he got away with 15 years ago. This is a story of redemption, of a fight against a filthy system he himself built. Watch to the end, hit like, and comment where you're watching from so I know how far this story has come. The rain started at dusk and never stopped. It came down in sheets across the Seattle waterfront, hammering the glass towers until the city looked like it was drowning in its own reflection. Kieran Valecroft stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his corner office on the 42nd floor, watching the lights blur into streaks of gold and red below. His phone buzzed for the 8th time in an hour. Another donor, another politician, another person who wanted something from him. He ignored it. Outside, the world saw Kieran Valecroft as a monument to success. Developer, philanthropist, the man who transformed Seattle's industrial waterfront into luxury condos and innovation hubs. His face appeared on magazine covers with headlines about second chances and the American dream. What they didn't know, what they could never know, was that every brick in his empire was mortared with blood money. Kieran left the office just after 9. His driver waited in the underground garage, engine running, steam rising from the exhaust into the cold air. The ride home took 20 minutes through rain-slicked streets lined with tents and tarps where people tried to stay dry. Kieran looked out the window and felt nothing. He'd trained himself not to feel. Feeling was a liability. Feeling meant remembering. The mansion sat on a private stretch of waterfront property surrounded by iron gates and security cameras. It was a modern fortress of stone and glass, all clean lines and calculated emptiness. Kieran designed it that way. No clutter, no warmth, nothing that could remind him of what he'd done to afford it. He entered through the side door that led into the mudroom. The house was quiet, too quiet. Mara, his housekeeper, usually had the kitchen lights on at this hour, preparing his dinner, even though he'd told her 100 times he didn't need her to wait up. She'd worked for him for 9 months now, efficient, silent, almost invisible, exactly the kind of employee Kieran preferred. But tonight the kitchen was dark except for a single amber light above the center island. Kieran's hand found the wall switch. The overhead lights flooded the room with harsh white brilliance. Mara lay on the marble floor in a pool of blood spreading from her midsection. Her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, her mouth slightly parted as if she'd been trying to say something when the knife went in. Her hands were pressed against the wound, fingers slick and red. Kieran's phone hit the floor. He was across the room in 3 strides, dropping to his knees beside her. His hands moved on instinct, pressing down over hers, trying to stop the bleeding, even though part of his brain was already calculating the size of the wound, the amount of blood, the pallor of her skin. Mara, stay with me." Her eyes shifted toward him. For a moment he thought she was already gone. Then her lips moved. "Celine," she whispered. "My name is Celine." Kieran's hands froze. Celine Ashford. The name hit him like a fist to the throat. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The room tilted sideways, and suddenly he was 20 years younger, standing in a warehouse in Tacoma, signing cargo manifests while his boss Victor explained that logistics was just logistics, and what happened in the containers below wasn't his concern. "You remember now?" Celine's voice was faint but sharp, each word a blade. 15 years ago, Tacoma. You signed the papers. You knew. "I didn't..." Kieran's voice cracked. "I didn't know what was in those containers." Liar. The word hung between them like smoke. Celine's hand moved slowly, reaching towards something on the floor beside her, a folded piece of paper, edges soaked in her blood. She pressed it into Kieran's palm. "You built the cage I survived," she said. "Now you're going to burn it down." Her eyes rolled back. Her body went slack. Kieran's hands were shaking as he fumbled for his phone, dialing 911, shouting his address to the dispatcher while he tried to keep pressure on the wound, even though he could feel her heartbeat fading under his fingers. The operator kept telling him to stay calm, to keep her warm, to keep talking to her. But Celine wasn't listening anymore. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes. Paramedics swarmed the kitchen, pushing Kieran aside, hooking Celine up to monitors and IV lines while they loaded her onto a stretcher. One of them asked if he knew who did this. Kieran shook his head. Another asked if she had family. He didn't know. He didn't know anything about her except that she cleaned his house and now she was dying on his kitchen floor. They wheeled her out into the rain. Kieran stood alone in the kitchen, blood drying on his hands, staring at the folded note Celine had given him. He opened it slowly. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. You built the cage she survived. Now someone wants to rebuild it. Check your secure email. You have 48 hours. Damien. Kieran's knees buckled. He grabbed the counter to stay upright, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. That name. He hadn't heard that name in 15 years. Damien Voss. The architect. The man who ran the entire operation while men like Kieran kept their heads down and their hands clean. Except Kieran's hands were never clean. He staggered to his home office, fingers fumbling with his laptop password. His secure email, an encrypted account he kept for sensitive business dealings, had one new message. No subject line, sent from an anonymous server. Kieran opened it. The first thing he saw was a photograph. A cargo ship at night, massive and dark, cutting through black water. The name stenciled on the hull, North Star Dominion. Below the photo, a single line of text, 43 souls. Pacific Crossing. Arrives in 72 hours. Your infrastructure, your choice. Cooperate, or I release everything. Attached to the email were files, dozens of them, financial records, shipping manifests, offshore account statements, photos of Kieran standing outside warehouses in Tacoma, shaking hands with Victor, signing papers on clipboards. 15 years of evidence, 15 years of secrets Kieran thought he'd buried deep enough to never see daylight again. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Kieran answered. Hello, Kieran? The voice was smooth, almost friendly. Damien Voss. I hope you received my message. What do you want? The same thing I've always wanted, access. You've built quite the empire since we last spoke. Modern shipping terminals, political connections, a spotless reputation. I need all of it. Kieran's hand tightened around the phone. I'm not part of that world anymore. Of course you are. You just convinced yourself otherwise. But the past doesn't disappear, Kieran. It waits. I'll go to the police. I'll tell them everything. Damien laughed. It was a cold sound, empty of humor. Go ahead. But before you do, ask yourself who benefits from the empire I've built. Ask yourself who's invested in keeping it running smoothly. Senators. Federal officials. CEOs hiding behind charity foundations. You think the system will protect you? The system is owned by the same people who profit from those 43 souls crossing the Pacific right now. Kieran felt the room closing in. And Celine, collateral damage, she got too close, started asking questions, threatened to expose everything. I had to remind you what happens when people forget their place. You tried to kill her. I sent a message. Whether she survives it is irrelevant. What matters is that you understand the stakes. I'm not helping you. Then Celine's story goes public. Every detail of her trauma, every moment of her captivity. The media will tear her apart, and you'll watch from the sidelines knowing you could have saved her. And after that, I release the files. Your career ends. Your freedom ends. Everything you've built turns to ash. The line went dead. Kieran sat in the dark office, staring at the glowing screen, his reflection ghostly in the black mirror of the window behind him. Outside, the rain kept falling. It always did in Seattle. People joked that it never stopped. But tonight, it felt like the sky itself was trying to wash something away and failing. He thought about Celine lying on the floor, blood spreading across the marble in slow, dark rivers. He thought about the cargo ship cutting through black water, carrying people locked in steel containers the same way he'd helped lock them 15 years ago. He thought about Damien's voice, calm and certain, explaining the rules of a game Kieran thought he'd escaped. But you never escaped. You just stopped looking. Kieran opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out an old burner phone he'd kept for years, telling himself it was paranoia, that he'd never need it. He powered it on and dialed a number he'd memorized a lifetime ago. The call connected after 3 rings. Valecroft. The voice on the other end was gravel and smoke. Adrian Locke, former military contractor, the kind of man who operated in the spaces between legal and necessary. I need your help. I don't do favors. I'll pay you whatever you want. There was a pause. Then, what kind of help? Kieran stared at the photo of the North Star Dominion on his screen. The kind that keeps people alive. When? 72 hours. That's not a lot of time. It's all we have. Another pause. Longer this time. Kieran could hear Adrian breathing on the other end, calculating risks and costs. Send me everything you know, Adrian said finally. And Kieran, don't lie to me about what this is. If I'm walking into something dirty, I need to know exactly how dirty. It's the worst thing you can imagine. Then we'll need more than just me. The call ended. Kieran sat back in his chair, exhaustion pressing down on him like a physical weight. His hands were still shaking. He looked at them in the dim light, clean now, the blood washed away, but he could still feel it, sticky and warm. Celine's life draining away under his fingers. He thought about calling the police, thought about walking into a federal building and confessing everything, handing over the files, letting the system decide what happened next. But Damien was right about one thing. The system was owned. Kieran had seen it himself over the years. The way investigations disappeared. The way powerful people stayed untouchable behind layers of lawyers and shell companies and charitable foundations that existed to launder reputations the same way offshore accounts laundered money. If he went to the authorities, Celine's story would become a media circus. The survivors on that ship would disappear into bureaucracy, deported or detained or lost in a system designed to process bodies, not save them. And Damien would walk away clean. Kieran pulled up the files again, scrolling through manifests and financial records, looking for something, anything that could give him leverage. His name was everywhere, signatures, approvals, transactions routed through accounts he'd set up back when he was young and hungry and stupid enough to believe that ambition justified anything. He found a document dated March 2011, a shipping contract for industrial equipment from Manila to Tacoma, signed by Kieran Valecroft, logistics coordinator, and approved by Victor Sokolov, operations director. Kieran remembered that shipment. He remembered standing in the warehouse at 3 a.m, watching the containers get unloaded, Victor smoking a cigarette by the loading dock, telling him not to worry about the manifests, that everything was handled. He remembered hearing something inside one of the containers, a sound like scratching, like someone trying to get out. He remembered Victor putting a hand on his shoulder and saying, "You didn't hear anything, understand?" And Kieran had nodded, because he wanted the promotion, because he wanted the money, because he wanted to matter. He closed the laptop and stood, his legs unsteady. The house felt enormous around him, all that empty space designed to keep the world at a distance. But tonight, the distance felt like a lie. The world was right here, bleeding on his kitchen floor, demanding an answer to a question he'd spent 15 years trying to avoid. What kind of man are you willing to become? Kieran walked back to the kitchen. The blood was still there, a dark stain spreading across the pale marble. He stared at it for a long time, thinking about Celine's face when she said her real name, the way her voice cut through the air like broken glass. "You built the cage I survived." He pulled out his phone and called the hospital. They told him Celine was in surgery. Critical condition. No visitors. They'd call if her status changed. Kieran hung up and dialed another number. It rang 4 times before a woman answered. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Agent Mercer speaking. "My name is Kieran Valecroft. I have information about a human trafficking operation. I need to speak with someone immediately." There was a pause. Keyboards clicking in the background. "Mr. Valecroft, can you describe the nature of this information?" "A cargo ship called the North Star Dominion is crossing the Pacific right now with 43 people locked in containers. It'll reach the coast in 72 hours. I have evidence connecting the operation to federal officials, politicians, and corporate executives." Another pause. Longer this time. "Mr. Valecroft, I need you to stay on the line. I'm going to transfer you to a specialist." The hold music was soft jazz. Kieran pressed the phone against his ear, staring at the blood on his kitchen floor, wondering if this was the right move or the worst mistake of his life. The music cut off. "Mr. Valecroft?" A man's voice. Calm, professional. "This is Deputy Director Harrington. I understand you have information about a trafficking operation?" "Yes. I have files, evidence. everything you need to stop it. And how did you come into possession of this information? Kieran hesitated. I was involved 15 years ago. I worked logistics for the original network. I thought it was over, but someone's bringing it back. I see. And you're willing to testify? Yes, whatever it takes. That's very brave, Mr. Valecroft. We'll need to bring you in for a formal interview. Can you come to the Seattle field office tomorrow morning? What about the ship? You need to intercept it before... We'll handle that. Right now, I need you to preserve all evidence and prepare for questioning. 9 a.m. tomorrow. Don't discuss this with anyone else. Understood? Understood. The call ended. Kieran stood in the kitchen, phone in hand, trying to convince himself he'd done the right thing. But something about the conversation felt wrong. The way Harrington's voice had smoothed over when Kieran mentioned federal officials, the way he'd redirected from the ship to the interview, the way he'd asked Kieran not to talk to anyone else. Kieran's phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. They won't help you. Check the news. Kieran opened his browser and searched for Deputy Director Harrington. The results loaded slowly. When they appeared, his stomach dropped. Deputy Director Michael Harrington, 25 years with the Bureau, recipient of multiple commendations, currently under internal review for alleged connections to corporate lobbying groups. And there, buried in a profile from 2 years ago, a photograph from a charity gala. Harrington shaking hands with Lucien Thorne. Lucien Thorne, tech billionaire, philanthropist, founder of the Thorne Foundation, which funded anti-trafficking initiatives across Southeast Asia. Kieran clicked deeper, pulling up financial records, donor lists, board memberships. The pattern emerged slowly, like a bruise spreading under skin. Thorne Foundation donations routed through shell companies in Panama and Singapore. Board members with ties to shipping conglomerates. Charity events attended by the same politicians Damien had mentioned. A humanitarian empire built on top of the machine it claimed to fight. Kieran's hands went cold. The system wasn't just owned, it was the operation. His phone rang. Hospital. He answered with shaking fingers. Mr. Valecroft, this is Dr. Rains from Harborview Medical Center. I'm calling about Celine Ashford. Is she... She's stable. The surgery went well. She's sedated now, but she'll recover. Kieran's knees buckled. He sat down hard on the kitchen floor, his back against the island, breathing coming easier for the first time in hours. Can I see her? Not tonight. Maybe tomorrow afternoon if she's awake. But, Mr. Valecroft, there's something you should know. When we admitted her, we found evidence of old injuries, extensive scarring consistent with prolonged captivity and abuse. I've notified the police. They'll want to speak with her when she's conscious. Kieran closed his eyes. Thank you, doctor. He ended the call and sat in the dark kitchen, surrounded by blood and silence, holding a phone full of evidence that could destroy him or save lives depending on which choice he made next. The rain hammered the windows. Kieran thought about the cargo ship cutting through black water somewhere in the Pacific. 43 people locked in steel containers, breathing recycled air, wondering if they'd survive the crossing. He thought about Celine lying in a hospital bed with 15 years of scars under her skin. He thought about Damien sitting somewhere comfortable and untouchable, orchestrating suffering the same way other men orchestrated symphonies. And he thought about the manifests he'd signed, the promotions he'd accepted, the way he'd trained himself not to hear the scratching sounds inside the containers because hearing meant knowing, and knowing meant choosing. For 15 years, Kieran had chosen silence. He stood slowly, legs unsteady, and walked back to his office. The secure email was still open on his laptop. He hit reply and typed 3 words. I'm coming for you. He didn't send it. Instead, he opened a new message to Adrian Locke and attached every file Damien had sent him. Financial records, manifests, photos, everything. Then he added one more thing, his own confession. Every signature, every transaction, every moment he'd looked the other way because it was easier than facing what he'd become. He typed a subject line, no lies. Full disclosure, are you still in? His finger hovered over the send button. Outside, lightning split the sky, turning the waterfront white for a moment before plunging it back into darkness. Kieran pressed send. Then he walked to his bedroom, lay down fully clothed on top of the covers, and stared at the ceiling, waiting for morning to come or the world to end. Whichever happened first. Somewhere in the dark, his phone buzzed. Adrian's reply loaded on the screen. I'm in, but you're coming with us. If this goes wrong, you don't get to hide behind a desk while people die. You're on the boat. Kieran read the message 3 times. Then he typed back, agreed. He set the phone on the nightstand and closed his eyes, knowing sleep wouldn't come but needing the darkness anyway. Outside, the city kept breathing, towers of glass and steel rising into the rain, people sleeping in beds and doorways, dreaming or not dreaming, unaware that somewhere in the Pacific a ship was coming closer, carrying cargo that would force someone to finally choose between silence and truth. And in a hospital room across town, Celine Ashford lay motionless under fluorescent lights, machines beeping steadily beside her, a name reclaimed and a past refusing to stay buried. The clock ticked toward sunrise. 48 hours remaining. Kieran didn't sleep. He lay on top of the covers watching the ceiling fan spin slow circles through the dark, counting rotations like a prisoner counting days. His phone sat on the nightstand, screen dark, waiting for the next message that would confirm his life was truly over or give him one last chance to save something worth saving. At 5:30 in the morning, he gave up pretending and went downstairs. The kitchen still smelled like copper and antiseptic. A cleaning crew had come during the night, professionals who didn't ask questions, and removed the blood, but the smell lingered in the grout between tiles, invisible and permanent. Kieran stood in the doorway staring at the spot where Celine had fallen, trying to reconcile the woman who'd cleaned his house in silence for 9 months with the survivor who'd spent those same months studying him like evidence. His phone buzzed. Adrian, warehouse on Harbor Island, 700, bring the files. Kieran typed back, on my way. He showered, dressed in dark clothes that wouldn't stand out, and grabbed a waterproof bag for his laptop. The drive to Harbor Island took 20 minutes through dawn traffic, rain still falling in steady sheets that turned the streets into rivers of reflected brake lights. The warehouse sat at the end of an access road lined with shipping containers stacked like steel coffins. No signs, no markings, just a rusted roll-up door and a camera mounted above the frame. Kieran parked and walked to the door. It opened before he could knock. Adrian Locke stood in the doorway, 6 feet of muscle and scar tissue wrapped in a tactical jacket still wet from the rain. His face was all hard angles and old violence, the kind of face that belonged to men who'd seen things break and learned to accept it. You look like hell, Adrian said. I feel worse. Good, means you're taking this seriously. Kieran followed him inside. The warehouse was mostly empty except for a folding table in the center, surrounded by camping chairs and portable work lights that cast harsh shadows across the concrete floor. 3 other people sat around the table, all of them looking up as Kieran approached. Adrian pointed to each in turn. That's Yara. Communications and surveillance. Yara was maybe 30, compact and wiry, with short dark hair and eyes that didn't blink often enough. She nodded once, but didn't speak. Marcus. Maritime specialist. He'll get us on the ship. Marcus was older, weathered skin and gray stubble, hands scarred from years of rope work and salt water. He studied Kieran the way you'd study a weak link in a chain. And Nate, medic. He keeps people breathing when things go wrong. Nate looked barely old enough to drink, all nervous energy and quick hands, a medical kit open on the table in front of him like a security blanket. Adrian pulled out a chair. Sit. Show us what you've got. Kieran set his laptop on the table and opened the files. For the next hour, he walked them through everything. The shipping manifest from 15 years ago. The financial records connecting Damien Voss to current operations. The encrypted message about the North Star Dominion. The connections between Lucian Thorne's foundation and the trafficking network. Nobody interrupted. They just listened, faces neutral, absorbing information the way professionals absorbed mission parameters. When Kieran finished, Adrian leaned back in his chair. So let me make sure I understand. You helped run a trafficking operation 15 years ago. You got out, got rich, convinced yourself it was over. Now the guy who ran the whole thing wants you back in, and if you refuse, he exposes you and lets 43 people disappear into the same machine you helped build. That's the summary. And your housekeeper, this Celine woman, she was one of the victims. Yes. And she spent 9 months working for you without saying a word. Yes. Yara spoke for the first time. Her voice was flat, emotionless. Why? What? Why did she wait? Why infiltrate your house instead of just going to the police? Kieran shook his head. I don't know. You don't know or you don't want to say? I don't know. Marcus leaned forward. The ship. The North Star Dominion. You got coordinates. Kieran pulled up the tracking data Damien had included. Last known position was 300 nautical miles off the coast. Moving at 12 knots. Based on current trajectory, it'll reach Seattle shipping lanes in about 60 hours. Can't intercept that far out. Too much open water. Coast Guard would spot us before we got close. So we wait until it's closer? We wait until it's in territorial waters. Then we hit it fast and get out before anyone knows we're there. Nate looked up from his medical kit. And the people inside the containers? How do we know they'll survive that long? Nobody answered. The question hung in the air like smoke. Finally, Adrian stood. Here's what we do. We prep for a maritime boarding operation. 3 boats, small and fast. We approach at night, climb the hull, secure the deck, locate the containers, extract the survivors, and transmit evidence to every media outlet that'll listen before the feds can bury it. In and out in 40 minutes. That's insane, Kieran said. You got a better plan? We go to the authorities, force them to act. You already tried that. How'd it work out? Kieran didn't answer. Adrian crossed his arms. Look, I get it. You want this to be clean, legal, but the system you're trying to use is the same system protecting these people. You go through official channels, and that ship disappears, gets rerouted. The survivors get moved to a different vessel or dumped overboard, and you'll never prove they existed. This is the only way. It's piracy. Yeah, it is. We'll go to prison. Maybe. But those people won't die in a steel box. Kieran looked around the table. Yara was checking her equipment, expression unreadable. Marcus was studying maritime charts on a tablet. Nate was reorganizing his medical supplies for the 3rd time, hands shaking slightly. Why are you doing this? Kieran asked. What do you get out of it? Adrian's jaw tightened. I spent 10 years fighting wars for people who didn't give a damn about the reasons. Politicians and contractors and defense firms making billions while kids bled out in the sand. You know what I learned? The system doesn't save people. People save people. Everything else is just paperwork and excuses. He turned to the others. We've got 58 hours to plan this and acquire equipment. Marcus, I need boat options and approach vectors. Yara, surveillance on the ship and any escort vessels. Nate, trauma protocols for potential dehydration, hypothermia, and oxygen deprivation. Move. They scattered to different corners of the warehouse, pulling out laptops and gear, transforming the empty space into a command center. Kieran sat at the table feeling useless, watching people who actually knew how to fight prepare for a battle he'd started 15 years ago with a signature on a manifest. Adrian sat down across from him. You're not just along for the ride. You're going in with us. I'm not trained for this. Don't need you to be. I need you to identify cargo manifests, unlock shipping databases, and talk to the survivors if we find them. You speak any other languages? Some Spanish, a little Mandarin. That'll work. Most trafficking routes run through Southeast Asia and Latin America. Someone on that ship might understand you. Kieran's hands felt cold. And if things go wrong, then we improvise. But Kieran, understand something. The second we board that vessel, there's no backing out. You're committed. No changing your mind halfway through because you got scared or had second thoughts. People's lives are going to depend on you not freezing. Can you handle that? Kieran thought about Celine lying on his kitchen floor, blood spreading across marble. He thought about the scratching sound inside the container 15 years ago and the way he'd pretended not to hear it. Yes, he said, I can handle it. Adrian studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right. Get some rest. We move tomorrow night. Kieran stood to leave, then stopped. Adrian, when this is over, when we expose everything, Damien's going to release those files. My part in all this will go public. I know. I'll lose everything. Probably. And you're okay with that? Adrian's expression didn't change. I'm okay with stopping a ship full of people from dying. What happens to your reputation after that isn't my concern. You made choices 15 years ago. Now you live with them. At least you'll be alive to face the consequences. That's more than those people in the containers can say. Kieran left the warehouse feeling like he'd been gutted. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy with mist and the smell of salt water. He sat in his car for a long time, staring through the windshield at nothing, trying to convince himself he was doing the right thing. His phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. "Mr. Valecroft, this is Agent Naomi Mercer with the FBI. We spoke briefly when you were transferred to Deputy Director Harrington." Kieran's pulse spiked. "I remember. I need to speak with you, in person, not at the field office." "Why?" "Because I think Harrington buried your report, and I think you're in danger." Kieran looked around the parking lot, empty except for a few parked trucks and shipping containers. "Where?" "There's a coffee shop on Pike Street, Slate and Steam. 1 hour." The line went dead. Kieran drove back into the city on autopilot, his mind racing through possibilities. This could be a trap, another layer of the system trying to corner him, or it could be the only honest federal agent left in Seattle. He parked 3 blocks from the coffee shop and walked the rest of the way, checking over his shoulder every few steps. The shop was small and crowded with morning commuters grabbing espresso before work. Kieran ordered black coffee and sat in the back corner where he could see the door. Agent Naomi Mercer arrived exactly on time. She was maybe 40, dark skin and sharp eyes, wearing a navy pantsuit that looked slept in. She sat down across from him without ordering anything. "You recorded your conversation with Harrington?" she asked. "No." "Smart. He would have had you arrested for it." She pulled out a phone and set it on the table between them. "I've been investigating trafficking networks for 6 years. Every time I get close to something real, the case gets reassigned or shut down for lack of evidence. Last year, I started tracking financial connections between shipping companies and charitable foundations. You know what I found?" Lucian Thorne. Her eyes narrowed. "How do you know that name?" "Same way you do, following the money." Mercer leaned back. "Thorne's untouchable. His foundation has friends in Congress, the State Department, Homeland Security. He throws galas where senators rub shoulders with tech billionaires, all of them congratulating each other for fighting the very thing they're profiting from. And when investigators like me get too close, we get transferred to field offices in Montana or desk jobs reviewing cold cases." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you called in a report about the North Star Dominion, and 6 hours later, Harrington buried it. That ship doesn't exist according to official records. No registry, no cargo manifest, no scheduled port arrival, which means someone very powerful wants it to land quietly." Kieran's coffee sat untouched, going cold. "Can you stop it?" "Not through official channels. I tried. My supervisor told me to drop it. When I pushed, he threatened disciplinary action." She looked at him directly. "But if someone were to intercept that ship and expose what's inside before it reaches port, the Bureau would have no choice but to investigate, especially if the evidence went public. You're asking me to commit a federal crime. I'm telling you that sometimes the law protects the wrong people. And sometimes the only way to fix that is to force the truth into the light where it can't be ignored." Kieran stared at her. "You know what I did 15 years ago. You know I was part of this. I know you signed manifests for Viktor Sokolov's shipping operation in Tacoma. I know money moved through accounts connected to you. I also know you left that world and tried to bury it. The question is whether you're willing to dig it back up and face what you did." "And if I am?" Mercer slid a piece of paper across the table. "This is a secure satellite phone number. When you have evidence, real, undeniable proof of what's on that ship, you call me. I'll make sure it gets to journalists, advocacy groups, and international watchdogs before the Bureau can suppress it. But Valecroft, understand this. Once you start, you can't stop halfway. You go all the way, or people die and nothing changes." She stood to leave. "Why are you helping me?" Kieran asked. Mercer looked at him with something that might have been pity or contempt or both. "I'm not helping you. I'm helping the people locked in those containers. You're just the tool I have to use." She walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. Kieran sat alone with cold coffee and a phone number that felt like a grenade in his pocket. Outside, the city moved through its routines, people hurrying to work, delivery trucks blocking intersections, construction crews tearing up sidewalks. Normal life happening all around him while he sat at the center of something that would destroy normal forever. He left the shop and drove to Harborview Medical Center. Celine was awake. The nurse at the desk told him visiting hours didn't start until noon, but when Kieran explained he was the one who'd called 911, she checked with someone and nodded him through. Celine's room was on the 4th floor, small and white, machines beeping softly beside the bed. She looked smaller than he remembered. Pale against the sheets, IV lines running into her arm, bandages wrapped around her midsection. Her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. "You're alive," Kieran said. "Disappointed?" "No." Celine turned her head slowly to look at him. "You should be. Would make things simpler." Kieran pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. "Why didn't you tell me who you were? Would you have listened?" "I don't know." "Exactly." Her voice was rough, damaged by intubation and hours of surgery. "I needed to see what kind of man you'd become. Whether you remembered, whether you felt anything at all." "And what did you find?" "A coward who bought expensive art and threw charity dinners to avoid looking in the mirror." The words hit like fists, but Kieran didn't argue. "You're right." Celine's eyes widened slightly. Whatever she'd expected, it wasn't agreement. "What?" "You're right. I was a coward. I am a coward. I spent 15 years pretending I didn't hear people screaming inside those containers. Pretending signatures on paper didn't mean anything. Building an empire on blood money and calling it success. So what changed?" "You. Lying on my floor, telling me your real name." Kieran leaned forward. "I'm going after the ship, the North Star Dominion. I'm going to stop it and expose everyone involved." Celine studied him. "That's suicide." "Probably. Damien will destroy you." "I know. And you think that makes it okay? You think one noble sacrifice erases 15 years of looking away?" "No." Kieran's hands tightened on his knees. "But it's the only thing I can do that might matter." Celine was quiet for a long time. Machines beeped. Somewhere down the hall, a patient called for a nurse. Finally, she spoke. "When I was 13, they locked me in a container with 16 other girls. We crossed the Pacific in darkness, breathing air that tasted like metal and vomit. 2 of them died before we reached land. The rest of us, we survived, but we weren't alive anymore. Not really. We were inventory, property, things that existed to be used and discarded." Her voice didn't shake. It was flat, factual, the tone of someone reciting evidence. "I spent 6 years in that system, moved between houses and cities and countries, different men, different languages, same darkness. And the whole time, I kept thinking about the man I'd seen in the warehouse in Tacoma, the one in the expensive jacket who signed papers without looking at what he was signing. I remember thinking, he doesn't know we exist. And that was worse than the men who hurt us, because at least they acknowledged we were human enough to suffer. You didn't even give us that." Kieran felt something breaking inside his chest, sharp and irreversible. "How did you get out?" "A raid. Federal agents hit the house where they were keeping us. Most of the girls got deported back to countries that didn't want them. I got lucky. An advocacy group helped me get asylum, therapy, a new identity. They told me to move on, build a new life, forget." "But you didn't." "No. I spent years tracking the network, learning names, following money trails, and eventually I found you, living in your waterfront mansion, giving speeches about second chances, completely untouched by any consequence. So I became Mara. I cleaned your house and watched you pretend to be a good man." "Why not just go to the police?" Celine laughed, bitter and sharp. "You really don't understand, do you? The police were part of it, some of them anyway. I saw badges at the houses, heard them on phone calls coordinating shipments. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, for people like you." Kieran stood, pacing to the window. Outside, the city spread beneath low clouds, rain starting again in thin gray sheets. "I can't undo what I did." "No, you can't. But I can stop it from happening again. To those 43 people. To anyone else." "How?" He turned to face her. "We're going to board that ship, extract the survivors, broadcast everything before the authorities can suppress it, force the truth into public view." Celine pushed herself up slightly, wincing at the pain. "That's insane." "I know." "You'll die." "Maybe, but at least I'll die doing something that matters instead of hiding behind lawyers and press releases." She stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached for the call button and pressed it. A nurse appeared in the doorway seconds later. "I need to be discharged," Celine said. The nurse's eyes widened. Ms. Ashford, you just had surgery. You need at least 3 more days of observation. I'm checking myself out against medical advice. Whatever paperwork you need, bring it. The nurse looked at Kieran like this was his fault. Maybe it was. She disappeared, muttering about doctors and liability. Kieran moved closer to the bed. What are you doing? Coming with you. No, absolutely not. You're injured. You nearly died. Celine's eyes burned into him. Those people on that ship, when you open those containers, they're going to see men with guns. They're going to think it's another transaction, another transfer to a worse place. You need someone who understands what they've been through, someone who speaks their language. Not just words, their fear. You can barely stand. I'll manage. Celine, stop! Her voice cut through the air like a blade. You don't get to protect me. You don't get to decide what I'm strong enough to handle. I spent 15 years surviving things you can't imagine. This ship, this operation, it's not yours to control. I'm going. You can either accept that or get out of my way. Kieran opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. She was right. This wasn't about him. It never had been. Okay, he said quietly. Okay. The nurse returned with discharge papers and a lecture about infection risks and pain management. Celine signed everything without reading it, got dressed in the clothes Kieran had found in her room at his house, jeans and a dark sweater, and walked out of the hospital with one hand pressed against her bandaged side. They drove to Harbor Island in silence. The warehouse looked the same as before, except now there were 3 boats on trailers parked inside. Matty black rigid hull inflatables equipped with outboard motors and storage compartments. Adrian and his team were loading equipment, climbing gear, communications equipment, waterproof packs. Adrian looked up as Kieran and Celine entered. His expression hardened when he saw her condition. No, he said flatly. Yes, Celine replied. You're injured. You'll slow us down. I speak Tagalog, Thai, Spanish, and Mandarin. How many of your team can say that? Adrian glanced at the others. Marcus shook his head. Yara shrugged. Nate looked uncomfortable. Languages won't help if you pass out climbing a cargo net, Adrian said. Celine walked to the nearest boat, grabbed the gunwale, and pulled herself up and over the side with one smooth motion despite the obvious pain it caused. She stood in the boat, breathing hard, sweat on her forehead. I'll keep up, she said. Adrian stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Kieran. She dies. It's on you. I know. And you're good with that? Kieran looked at Celine standing in the boat, jaw set, eyes fierce. She'd survived things that would have broken him. She'd spent 15 years clawing her way back to something resembling life, while he'd spent the same time hiding behind wealth and manufactured respectability. She doesn't need my permission, Kieran said. And she sure as hell doesn't need my protection. Adrian sighed. Fine, but you both follow orders. No improvising, no heroics. We have one objective. Get those people off that ship alive. Everything else is secondary. Understood? They both nodded. Good. We launch in 22 hours. Yara's got the surveillance package ready. Marcus has the approach vector. Nate's prepping medical supplies for mass casualties. Kieran, you're with me. I need you to walk me through cargo container specifications, how they're locked, how they're ventilated, how we open them without causing a panic. The next 20 hours blurred together. Kieran explained shipping container mechanics while Adrian took notes. They reviewed blueprints of cargo vessels similar to the North Star Dominion, identifying weak points in security, optimal boarding locations, escape routes if things went wrong. Celine worked with Nate on trauma protocols for survivors. Her medical knowledge from years of working with advocacy groups filling gaps in his emergency training. Marcus monitored the ship's progress on satellite tracking, calling out position updates every few hours. The North Star Dominion was making steady progress towards Seattle, moving through international waters like it had every right to exist. At midnight, Adrian gathered everyone around the table. Latest intelligence puts the ship entering U.S. territorial waters at 0300 tomorrow. We intercept at 0400 when visibility's lowest and crew rotations are minimal. Weather forecast shows heavy cloud cover, no moon, perfect conditions. He pulled up a diagram of the ship on a tablet. The North Star Dominion is a mid-size cargo vessel, 300 meters long, registered to a shell company in Liberia. Crew complement is probably 15 to 20. Armed security likely, but we won't know how many until we're on deck. What about Coast Guard patrols? Yara asked. Marcus has us approaching from the northwest quadrant, where patrol density is lowest. We'll have maybe 30 minutes before someone notices the ship stopped transmitting position data. And if we don't make it off in 30 minutes? Adrian's expression didn't change. Then we don't make it off. Nobody spoke. He continued. Rules of engagement. We're not here to kill anyone. We secure the deck, neutralize resistance with non-lethal force if possible, locate the containers, extract survivors, and transmit evidence. But if someone starts shooting, we shoot back. Clear? Everyone nodded except Kieran, who was trying to process the reality that in less than 4 hours, he'd be climbing onto a moving cargo ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Gear up, Adrian said. We roll in 30. They dressed in black tactical gear and life vests. Adrian distributed waterproof communication headsets and handheld radios. Nate passed out seasickness medication. Marcus checked the boats one final time, running through engine diagnostics and fuel calculations. Kieran pulled on a vest that felt too heavy, strapped a radio to his belt, and wondered if this was what soldiers felt like before combat, terrified but committed, aware that backing out wasn't an option anymore. Celine appeared beside him. She'd changed into gear Yara had found that almost fit, her face pale but determined. You scared? She asked. Terrified. Good. Means you're sane. Are you scared? She looked at him directly. I've been scared every day for 15 years. This is just a different flavor. The boats launched from a private dock at 0230. 3 vessels cutting through black water under a moonless sky, waves chopping against the hulls as they pushed northwest into open ocean. Kieran rowed in the lead boat with Adrian and Marcus, spray soaking his face, hands gripping the gunwale so hard his knuckles went white. The shore lights of Seattle faded behind them until there was nothing but darkness and the sound of engines growling through the night. After 90 minutes, Marcus killed the running lights. They slowed, drifting in silence, waiting. Yara's voice crackled through the headset. Target acquired. Bearing 270. Range 4,000 meters. Kieran saw it then. A massive dark shape moving through the water, lights at the stern and along the superstructure. A cargo vessel hauling steel containers stacked 5 high toward a destination that would never officially exist. Adrian raised his fist. The boat surged forward. Kieran's heart hammered against his ribs as they closed the distance, waves slamming into the hull, cold water soaking through his gear. This was real. This was happening. In minutes, he'd either be saving lives or dying in the dark Pacific, and there was no in-between. The ship loomed larger, a wall of steel rising from the water. Marcus brought them alongside the hull, matching speed, the boat pitching violently in the wake. Adrian fired a grappling hook upward. It caught on the deck railing with a metallic clang that sounded like a gunshot in the night. Go, 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 Adrian hissed. He climbed first, hauling himself up the rope with practiced efficiency. Kieran followed, hands burning, muscles screaming, trying not to look down at the black water rushing past below. He reached the deck and rolled over the railing, gasping. Celine came up behind him, moving slower but steady, her face twisted with pain she refused to acknowledge. The deck was a maze of shipping containers stacked in rows, creating narrow corridors of steel. Somewhere below, engines rumbled. Somewhere ahead, people were dying in the dark. Adrian moved forward in a crouch, weapon raised. The others followed, spreading out in tactical formation. They'd made it aboard. Now came the hard part. A door opened 20 meters ahead. Light spilled across the deck. A crew member stepped out, cigarette in hand, looking bored. He saw them. His eyes went wide. He opened his mouth to shout, and everything went to hell. Adrian moved before the crew member's mouth could form the first syllable of a warning. He crossed the 20 meters in seconds, weapon raised, and slammed the butt into the man's temple. The crew member dropped without a sound, cigarette tumbling from his fingers to the deck, where it glowed orange against black steel. Drag him, Adrian hissed. Marcus grabbed the unconscious man by his collar and hauled him into the shadow between 2 shipping containers. Yara was already moving forward, scanning for cameras, for motion sensors, for any sign they'd been compromised. Kieran's hands were shaking. The violence had been so sudden, so efficient, that his brain was still processing what he'd witnessed. 1 second, a man was standing there smoking, The next, he was unconscious and hidden, and the operation was continuing as if nothing had happened. Celine touched his arm. Keep moving. They advanced through the maze of containers, boots silent on wet steel, the Pacific wind carrying salt spray across the deck. Somewhere below, the ship's engines maintained their steady rhythm, oblivious to the intrusion happening above. Yara held up a fist. Everyone froze. She pointed toward the superstructure where a door stood partially open, warm light spilling out. Through it, Kieran could see a narrow corridor and hear voices speaking in what sounded like Russian. Adrian made hand signals Kieran didn't understand, but the others clearly did. They split into two groups, Adrian, Marcus, and Nate, moving toward the stern while Yara, Kieran, and Celine headed forward toward the cargo holds. The forward access hatch was locked with a heavy padlock and chain. Yara produced bolt cutters from her pack and worked in silence, metal teeth biting through hardened steel with quiet precision. The chain fell away. She pulled the hatch open to reveal a ladder descending into darkness. "Stay close," she whispered, and climbed down. Kieran followed, each rung slick with condensation, the smell rising from below thick with diesel fuel and something else, something organic and wrong that made his stomach clench. Celine came last, moving carefully, one hand pressed against her injured side. The cargo hold was a cathedral of steel and shadow. Shipping containers were stacked 3 high on either side, secured with chains and locking mechanisms designed to survive ocean storms. Overhead lights flickered weakly, casting everything in sickly yellow illumination. Yara moved between the containers, checking identification numbers against a manifest on her phone. Kieran watched her work, aware that every second they spent down here increased the chance of discovery. Then he heard it. A sound so faint he almost missed it beneath the engine noise and the creaking of the ship's hull. A scratching. Metal on metal. Coming from inside one of the containers. His blood went cold. "Here," he said, pointing. Yara swept her flashlight across the container's door. The identification number matched one from Damien's files. She pulled out a portable cutting torch and ignited it, the blue flame hissing as she applied it to the lock mechanism. The scratching grew louder, more desperate. "Hurry," Celine whispered. The lock gave way with a metallic snap. Yara pulled the door open and stepped back as the smell hit them. Human waste, vomit, fear, desperation compressed into a space meant for freight, not flesh. Kieran shined his light inside and saw hell. 43 people packed into a container designed for 20 cubic meter cargo loads. Men, women, children crammed together in darkness that had lasted for days. Some were conscious, blinking against the sudden light, hands raised to shield their eyes. Others lay motionless, skin gray, lips cracked and bleeding. A woman in the back clutched an infant that wasn't moving. "Nakakarinig ba ako sa inyo?" Celine said, her voice cutting through their terror with unexpected gentleness. "Can you hear me?" A few heads turned toward her voice. A young man near the door tried to speak but only managed a dry rasp. Celine switched to Spanish. "Agua. Médico. Estamos aquí para ayudar." She turned to Kieran. "We need Nate, now." Kieran keyed his radio. "We've found them. Forward hold, container 73 Alpha. Medical emergency, multiple casualties." Adrian's voice crackled back. "Copy. Nate's on his way. We've got a problem topside. Company." "How many?" 4 armed, maybe more below. We're engaging. Extract the survivors and prepare for rapid evac." The radio cut to static. Then the sound of gunfire erupted from somewhere above, sharp cracks that echoed through the steel hull like the ship itself was breaking apart. Yara pulled medical supplies from her pack. Water bottles, emergency blankets, glucose tablets. She began distributing them to the people nearest the door, while Celine climbed into the container, moving among the survivors, assessing conditions, speaking in multiple languages, her voice calm despite the chaos erupting above. Kieran stood frozen, staring at the faces emerging from the darkness. A girl no older than 12 with hollow eyes. A man with scars across his face from previous violence. An elderly woman holding the hand of someone who'd already stopped breathing. This was what his signatures had bought 15 years ago. This was the cargo he'd processed without looking. The inventory he'd logged into databases as industrial equipment and construction materials. He'd known, deep down, Beneath all the rationalizations and willful ignorance, he'd known, and he'd signed anyway. Nate appeared at the top of the ladder, medical kit slung over his shoulder, moving fast despite the precarious descent. He hit the deck and ran to the container, immediately triaging, checking pulses, looking at pupils, making rapid decisions about who could be saved and who was already gone. Severe dehydration across the board, he said, voice clipped and professional. 3 critical, 2 possibly DOA. I need IV fluids, oxygen, and a way to get them off the ship in the next 10 minutes or we're going to lose more. More gunfire from above. Closer now. The sound of boots running across the deck. Adrian's voice on his radio, breathing hard. Security's locked down the bridge. They're calling for backup. We've got maybe 15 minutes before Coast Guard or worse shows up. Start moving survivors topside. Kieran climbed into the container and grabbed the arm of the young man near the door, helping him stand. His legs barely supported his weight. Kieran half carried, half dragged him toward the exit, while Yara and Celine worked on the others. The survivors who could walk formed a shuffling line, leaning on each other, moving with the slow desperation of people who'd survived one nightmare only to wake into another. Those who couldn't walk were carried by Nate and Kieran, their bodies frighteningly light, all sharp angles and protruding bones. They got 12 people up the ladder before the shooting stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Kieran's radio crackled. Adrian, status? Nothing. Marcus? Static. Anyone respond? Then a voice Kieran hadn't heard in 15 years, smooth and cold like ice forming on glass. Hello, Kieran. Damien Voss. Kieran's hand tightened on the radio until his knuckles went white. Where are they? Your friends? Secured. Unharmed for now. Though that depends entirely on your next decisions. Let them go. I'd love to, but first we need to talk. Come topside, alone. You have 2 minutes. The radio went dead. Celine grabbed Kieran's arm. It's a trap. I know. Then don't go. If I don't, he kills them. If you do, he kills all of us. Kieran looked at the survivors huddled in the cargo hold, frightened faces turned toward him, waiting for someone to tell them what happened next. He thought about Adrian and Marcus and Nate, professional soldiers who'd signed on to this operation knowing the risks, but trusting that Kieran had told them everything. Except he hadn't. He hadn't told them about the full extent of Damien's network, hadn't explained how deep the corruption ran, hadn't mentioned that stopping one ship wouldn't stop the machine, because the machine was bigger than any of them had imagined. Get these people to the boats, Kieran said. Yara, you're in command. If I'm not back in 15 minutes, you leave without me. Kieran, that's an order. He climbed the ladder before anyone could argue, emerging onto the deck where rain had started falling again, cold and hard, turning everything slick and dangerous. Bodies lay scattered near the superstructure, crew members, not Adrian's team, which meant they were alive somewhere. Kieran moved toward the bridge, hands raised, making himself visible. Damien Voss stood on the observation deck like he owned the night itself. He looked exactly as Kieran remembered, tall, composed, wearing an expensive jacket that probably cost more than most people made in a year. His hair was gray now, but his eyes were the same. Calculating, devoid of empathy, the eyes of someone who'd learned to see humans as variables in equations. Beside him, 3 armed men held Adrian, Marcus, and Nate at gunpoint, zip-tied and kneeling. Kieran Valecroft, Damien said, his voice carrying across the deck despite the wind and rain. I have to admit, I'm impressed. I didn't think you had this in you. Let them go. In a moment. First, I want you to understand something. This little rescue mission of yours, it was never going to work. The ship you're standing on doesn't exist. The survivors in that container won't be found in any official records. And the people you're trying to expose, they're the same people who'll bury this story before morning. Kieran took a step forward. One of the armed men raised his weapon. How did you know we were coming? Kieran asked. Damien smiled. Because I told you to come. The encrypted message, the file drop, the 48-hour deadline. I gave you just enough information to make you feel like you had a choice, then waited for you to do exactly what I predicted. The words landed like punches. You wanted us to board this ship. Of course. You think I couldn't have rerouted around Seattle? Changed course to Vancouver or Portland? But where's the leverage in that? No, I needed you here, caught in the act. A desperate vigilante who hijacked a cargo vessel, assaulted the crew, and fabricated a trafficking story to cover his own past crimes. Kieran's mind raced, replaying every decision of the last 2 days, seeing them now through Damien's eyes. The warehouse meeting, the plan, the approach, all of it choreographed by someone who'd predicted his moves before he made them. The federal agent, Kieran said slowly. Mercer. She was yours. Not mine, but sympathetic to certain interests. She gave you just enough encouragement to commit to something spectacularly illegal. Now, when this story breaks, you're not a whistleblower, you're a criminal. And the survivors? What happens to them? They disappear, same as always. Deported to countries that won't ask questions, or relocated to facilities where no one will look for them. The beauty of this system, Kieran, is that it's designed to erase people. Once they're inside, they might as well not exist. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the deck in harsh white light. In that moment, Kieran saw everything clearly. The containers stacked like tombstones, the armed men standing guard over the only people who'd tried to help, the ocean spreading in all directions with nowhere to run. Why? Kieran asked. Why go through all this? Why not just kill me and be done with it? Damien walked to the railing, looking out at the black water. Because killing you accomplishes nothing. But destroying you? Breaking you publicly? That sends a message to everyone else who might consider defecting from the system. It says, you can't escape. You can't make amends. The past doesn't release you just because you developed a conscience. He turned back to Kieran. You had a choice 15 years ago. You chose money and status. Now you want redemption? Fine. But redemption requires sacrifice. Your freedom, your reputation, your life. And even then, it won't be enough to save these people. Kieran felt something inside him shift, some last remaining piece of the man he'd been crumbling into dust. What do you want from me? Simple. Surrender. Confess to orchestrating this entire operation. Tell the authorities you fabricated the trafficking story to cover embezzlement from your company. Take the fall. Go to prison. And in exchange, I let your team walk away. The survivors get processed through proper channels, which, yes, means most will be deported, but at least they'll be alive. And if I refuse, then everyone dies. Your team gets executed and dumped overboard. The survivors get locked back in that container and left to suffocate. And you get to watch it happen before joining them. Adrian's voice cut through the tension. Don't do it, Kieran. He's lying. Even if you confess, he'll kill us anyway. One of the guards smashed a rifle butt into Adrian's face. Blood sprayed across the deck. Adrian! Kieran lunged forward but stopped when all 3 weapons swung toward him. Damien sighed like a disappointed teacher. You see? This is why I prefer working with professionals. They understand leverage. Kieran's hands were shaking. His breath came in short gasps. Every option led to death, or worse. Every choice meant sacrificing someone. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A rhythmic thumping growing louder, cutting through the wind and rain. Helicopters. Damien heard it too. His expression shifted from smug certainty to confusion. What? The helicopters appeared over the horizon. 3 of them, running lights blazing, moving fast toward the ship. But these weren't Coast Guard birds. These were news helicopters, camera equipment visible on their sides, broadcasting live as they approached. Damien's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, stared at the screen, and his face went pale. What did you do? He whispered. Kieran felt a smile forming despite everything. I made a call before we left the warehouse. Gave a journalist friend everything. Every file you sent me. Every connection to Lucian Thorne. Every offshore account. With instructions to release it all if I didn't check in by 0430. He glanced at his watch. It's 0445. Damien's composure cracked. You idiot! You've just signed your own death warrant. Maybe, but I'm taking you with me. The helicopter circled overhead, cameras pointed down, broadcasting live footage of the North Star Dominion, the armed men, the containers, everything. Kieran could see the camera operators leaning out, getting angles, making sure the world saw what was happening on this ship. Damien barked orders to his men. Get below, lock down the containers, we're destroying evidence. But it was too late. The sound of approaching engines cut through the night. Coast Guard vessels, real ones this time, racing toward the ship with lights flashing and sirens wailing, and beyond them, more boats. Media, independent observers, people who'd seen the breaking news and were coming to verify it with their own eyes. Damien's operation was burning in real time, and he knew it. He turned to Kieran with hate in his eyes. "This isn't over." "Yeah," Kieran said. "It is." Damien raised a pistol Kieran hadn't seen him draw and pointed it directly at Kieran's chest. "You destroyed everything. 15 years of work. Billions in infrastructure. All because you couldn't live with your own guilt." His finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot was deafening, but Kieran didn't fall. Damien did. He collapsed against the railing, blood spreading across his expensive jacket, the pistol clattering to the deck. Behind him stood Celine, holding a flare gun she'd found in an emergency locker, smoke still rising from the barrel. The guard spun toward her, weapons raised. "Don't!" a new voice commanded. Agent Naomi Mercer stepped onto the deck from the interior corridor, FBI badge held high, flanked by a tactical team in full gear. "Federal agents, drop your weapons, now!" The guards looked at each other, then at Damien bleeding on the deck, then at the helicopters circling overhead broadcasting everything. One by one, they set down their rifles and raised their hands. Mercer's team moved in, securing the guards, cutting the zip ties on Adrian and his team. She walked to where Damien lay gasping, looked down at him without expression, then turned to Kieran. "You're under arrest," she said. "Maritime piracy, conspiracy, unlawful boarding of an international vessel." "I know. But first we need to get those survivors medical attention." She keyed her radio. "This is Mercer. We need medical evac for approximately 40 casualties. Critical condition. Authorization code 77 Delta." The Coast Guard vessels pulled alongside. Paramedics swarmed aboard with stretchers and equipment. The survivors were brought up from the cargo hold one by one, blinking against the lights, cameras capturing their faces, their condition, the undeniable truth of what they'd survived. Kieran watched them being loaded onto rescue boats, wrapped in thermal blankets, given water and oxygen and the first small mercy they'd received in however long they'd been locked in darkness. Celine appeared beside him, the flare gun still in her hand. "You were supposed to wait for backup. So were you." "I couldn't let him kill you." "Why not? Would have solved a lot of problems." She looked at him directly. "Because you're the only person who can testify to what happened 15 years ago. Because your guilt matters. Because watching you actually face consequences instead of hiding behind lawyers is the only thing that makes any of this mean something." Mercer approached with handcuffs. "Kieran Valecroft, you're under arrest. You have the right to remain silent." Kieran barely heard the Miranda warning. He was watching the sunrise breaking over the horizon, turning the Pacific from black to gray to gold. The helicopters still circled, cameras still rolling, broadcasting to a world that was just waking up to headlines about corruption and trafficking and the cargo ship that exposed everything. As Mercer snapped the cuffs on his wrists, Kieran saw Damien being loaded onto a stretcher, still alive but barely, paramedics working to stabilize him for transport. Their eyes met for a moment across the deck. Damien's lips moved, forming words Kieran couldn't hear over the wind and chaos, but he could read them clearly enough. "This isn't over." Then the paramedics wheeled him away, and Kieran was left standing in handcuffs, watching his entire world collapse around him. Adrian walked over, his face bruised from the rifle strike, dried blood on his chin. "That was the stupidest, reckless thing I've ever seen anyone do." "I know. Also the bravest. Doesn't feel brave. It never does." Adrian glanced at the survivors being evacuated, at the news helicopters documenting everything, at the federal agents now securing the ship. "You know you're going to prison." "Yeah." "Was it worth it?" Kieran watched a young girl being carried past on a stretcher, an IV line in her arm, her eyes open and aware for the first time in days. She looked at him as she passed, and something in her expression, fear and gratitude and confusion all mixed together, hit him harder than anything Damien could have said. "Ask me in 10 years, Kieran replied. Mercer led him toward the waiting Coast Guard vessel. As they walked, Kieran looked back at the North Star Dominion, at the containers still stacked on deck like monuments to suffering, at the place where he'd finally stopped running from what he'd done. But something was wrong. He could feel it in the way Mercer's grip tightened on his arm, in the way her tactical team was spreading out, weapons raised, sweeping the ship like they were looking for something specific. "What is it?" Kieran asked. Mercer's jaw tightened. We're missing someone. Who? Lucian Thorne was supposed to be on this vessel. Intelligence said he was personally overseeing the shipment, but he's not here. Kieran's blood went cold. Where is he? We don't know. He disappeared 6 hours ago. Left his estate in Seattle, no security detail, no driver. Just vanished. They reached the railing where a ladder descended to the Coast Guard boat. Kieran stopped, his mind racing. He knew, Kieran said slowly. Before I even made the call to that journalist. He knew this was coming. That's impossible. We had his communications under surveillance. Not the ones that matter. Mercer's radio crackled, a voice urgent and tight. We've got a problem in the cargo hold. You need to see this. They reversed course, heading back down into the ship where Yara and Nate were standing outside the container they'd opened earlier. The survivors had been evacuated, but something about the way Yara was staring into the empty space made Kieran's stomach drop. What is it? Mercer asked. Yara pointed her flashlight at the back wall of the container. There should be 43 people based on the manifests. We counted 41 alive and 2 dead. That's 43. So this container is modified. Look! She pressed against the back wall and it shifted, revealing a false panel. Behind it was a second compartment, smaller, designed to be hidden even from the people locked in the front section. Inside were 2 bodies, but these weren't trafficking victims. They were men in expensive suits, execution-style bullet wounds in their heads, documents scattered around them like evidence deliberately left behind. Mercer knelt beside them, checking pockets, pulling out identification. Her face went white. These are federal prosecutors. The ones who were building a case against Thorne's foundation last year. They disappeared. Everyone assumed witness protection. She stood slowly, looking at Kieran. This whole ship, the trafficking, the survivors, the rescue, it's cover. Thorne wasn't overseeing the shipment. He was disposing of evidence, people who could connect him to previous operations. And we just helped him do it. The implications crashed into Kieran like a physical blow. The survivors were real. Their suffering was real. But they were also camouflage for something worse, a mobile crematorium for people who knew too much, disguised as humanitarian crisis. He's been using the trafficking as a shield, Kieran said, the pieces falling into place. Every investigation, every rescue operation, every time authorities get close, he makes sure they find real victims, real suffering, just enough truth to distract from the bigger crimes. And now with this rescue broadcast worldwide, Mercer continued, every agency will focus on the trafficking network, while Thorne rebuilds somewhere else. New identity, new operation. We'll never find him. Kieran felt the handcuffs digging into his wrists, felt the weight of what he'd just done settling onto his shoulders. He'd saved 41 people, but he'd also given Lucian Thorne exactly what he needed, chaos and cover to disappear completely. Celine's voice came from behind them. He's not running. They turned. She stood in the cargo hold doorway, phone in her hand, face pale. What? Mercer asked. Thorne's not running. He's making a statement. She held up the phone showing a live press conference. Lucian Thorne stood at a podium surrounded by cameras, looking composed and sympathetic, speaking to reporters with the calm authority of someone who'd never done anything wrong in his life. Deeply troubled by these allegations, he was saying, the Thorne Foundation has worked for years to combat human trafficking. To learn that one of our shipping partners may have been involved in such horrific crimes is devastating. We're cooperating fully with federal investigations and have already initiated an independent audit of all our logistics contractors. Kieran watched the screen, watched Thorne play the victim, watched him transform from criminal to humanitarian in real time. He's going to get away with it, Celine whispered. Everything we did, everyone we saved, and he's still going to walk free. The press conference continued. Questions about the prosecutors whose bodies were just discovered. Thorne's response smooth and practiced. He'd been unaware of their connection to the shipping vessel, was horrified to learn of their fate, would establish a fund in their memory. Every answer perfect, every reaction calculated. A man who'd spent 15 years building layers of deniability and was now cashing in all of them. Mercer's radio erupted with updates. Federal agents raiding Thorne's estate, finding it empty. Bank accounts already closed and transferred. Private jets grounded, but no record of where he'd gone. Kieran realized with sick certainty that they'd been playing the wrong game entirely. Damien Voss was the architect, the builder. the one who'd created the network. But Lucien Thorne was the maestro. The one who'd learned to conduct the entire system like a symphony, using trafficking, corruption, murder, and media all as instruments to maintain power. And they'd just given him the performance of a lifetime. The Coast Guard captain approached Mercer. "Ma'am, we need to evacuate. Weather's deteriorating. We're getting the last of the survivors off now." "Go," Mercer said. "I'll be right behind you." As the captain left, she turned to Kieran. "This isn't how it was supposed to go." "It never is. Those people you saved, they're alive because of you. Remember that. And the people Thorne kills next, the prosecutors he'll dispose of, the networks he'll rebuild, that's on me too." Mercer didn't argue. They both knew he was right. They climbed back to the deck where dawn had fully broken, revealing the North Star Dominion in harsh daylight, a rusted cargo vessel that had almost become a tomb for 43 people and did become one for 2 federal prosecutors whose names Kieran would never forget. As they loaded him onto the Coast Guard boat, Kieran looked back one final time at the ship and saw something that made his heart stop. Written in spray paint across the side of a container, fresh enough that the paint was still dripping, were 4 words: "The cage still stands." He didn't recognize the handwriting, but he knew exactly who'd left the message. Lucien Thorne, not running, not hiding, still playing, and somehow, impossibly, still winning. The boat pulled away from the North Star Dominion, carrying Kieran toward a future of trials and prison and consequences he'd earned 15 years ago. Behind him, the ship grew smaller on the horizon until it was just another dark shape on the water, indistinguishable from legitimate commerce. Celine sat across from him, her face unreadable. "We failed," Kieran said. "We saved 41 people. And let the real monster escape. Then we find him again." "How? He's gone. Vanished. He could be anywhere in the world right now." Celine leaned forward, her voice low and fierce. "You think I spent 15 years tracking this network without learning how it works? Thorne didn't disappear. He's too arrogant for that. He's somewhere close, watching, waiting to see if anyone's smart enough to find him. And if we do, then we finish what we started. No federal agents, no press conferences, no rules." Kieran looked at her, seeing the survivor who'd become Mara, who'd become Celine again, seeing all the layers of identity she'd worn like armor. "That's vigilante justice." "No," she said, "that's survival. The system failed us. The law protects him. So we stopped playing by rules that were written to let men like Thorne win." The Coast Guard boat cut through choppy waves toward Seattle, toward cameras and lawyers, and a reckoning Kieran couldn't avoid. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a different plan was forming, darker, simpler. The kind of plan that couldn't be corrupted because it didn't rely on institutions or authority or anything except the will to see it through. Mercer sat down beside him. "When we get to shore, you're going into federal custody. I'll do what I can to argue for cooperation credit, but Kieran, you committed multiple felonies on camera. The best I can offer is a reduced sentence." "How long?" 5 years minimum, maybe 10. "And Thorne? We'll find him. Will you?" Mercer didn't answer. They both knew the truth. The boat docked at a federal pier where dozens of agents waited along with media crews kept at a distance by barricades. Kieran was led off in handcuffs while cameras captured every moment. The billionaire developer who'd orchestrated an illegal rescue mission that saved lives and exposed corruption, but also destroyed any credibility he might have had. The headlines would write themselves. As they processed him through intake, Kieran caught a glimpse of a television in the booking area showing aerial footage of the North Star Dominion being towed toward port by Coast Guard vessels. The chyron beneath read, "Rescued survivors receiving treatment. Investigation ongoing into billionaire philanthropist's alleged involvement." Alleged. That one word told him everything he needed to know about how this would end. They put him in a holding cell to await arraignment. The space was small and cold, smelling of disinfectant and desperation. Kieran sat on the metal bench and put his head in his hands, exhaustion finally catching up with everything adrenaline had kept at bay. He'd saved 41 people. He'd exposed part of a trafficking network. He'd destroyed his own life in the process. And the man responsible for orchestrating all of it was free, probably sipping coffee somewhere expensive while lawyers prepared his defense. The cell door opened. A guard stepped aside to let Celine enter. She moved carefully, her injury obvious in the way she held herself, but her eyes were clear and determined. "They're letting you go?" Kieran asked. "Witness cooperation. Mercer vouched for me." She sat down beside him on the bench. "I'm testifying against everyone. Damien, the crew, anyone I can identify from my time in the system." "Good. And then I'm coming for Thorne." Kieran looked at her. "Celine, don't. Don't tell me to let the system handle it. Don't tell me justice will prevail. We both know better." She pulled something from her pocket, a folded piece of paper. "While you were being processed, I made some calls. People I've worked with in survivor networks. People who've been tracking Thorne for years. And we found something." She unfolded the paper. It was a photograph, grainy but clear enough. Lucien Thorne standing on the deck of a yacht, somewhere tropical, holding a drink and smiling like he didn't have a care in the world. "Taken 3 hours ago," Celine said. "Transmitted from a contact in the Cayman Islands. He's not hiding, he's celebrating." Kieran stared at the photo, at the man who'd built an empire on suffering and was now enjoying the fruits of it somewhere beyond the reach of law. "When I get out," he said slowly, "however long that takes, I'm going to find him." "You won't have to wait that long." "What do you mean?" Celine stood, wincing at the pain. "Mercer knows Thorne will disappear if we don't act fast. She's off the record proposing a deal. You cooperate with an unofficial operation to locate and expose him. In exchange, your sentence gets reduced, and you're placed in a facility where you can still communicate with the team." "That's illegal." "So was boarding a cargo ship in international waters. You want legal, or you want results?" The guard appeared in the doorway. "Time's up." Celine walked toward the door, then turned back. "One more thing. Those words on the container. The cage still stands. Thorne's not wrong. We dismantled one ship, but the network runs through hundreds of vessels, dozens of ports, thousands of transactions. This fight doesn't end with him. It probably doesn't end in our lifetime." "Then why do it?" "Because every person we save is someone who gets to build a life instead of being erased by one. That has to be enough." She left. Kieran sat alone in the cell as night fell outside the small window, thinking about cages and the people trapped inside them, about systems built to profit from suffering, about the distance between justice and vengeance, and whether that distance even mattered anymore. Somewhere in the Cayman Islands, Lucien Thorne was sleeping in silk sheets. Somewhere in Seattle, 41 survivors were beginning the long process of remembering what it meant to be human instead of cargo. And somewhere in the space between those two realities, Kieran Valecroft was learning that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a war. And he'd just enlisted for a battle that would consume whatever remained of his life. The cell lights flickered. In the darkness, Kieran closed his eyes and saw containers stacked like coffins, saw Celine's blood spreading across marble, saw Damien falling and Thorne smiling and all the faces of people he couldn't save mixed with the ones he could. Tomorrow, the legal machinery would grind forward, lawyers and judges and plea deals. But underneath all that procedure and bureaucracy, another kind of justice was taking shape. The kind that didn't wait for verdicts. The kind that understood some cages could only be dismantled from the inside. The kind that required becoming exactly what you were fighting against. And Kieran was finally, terribly ready to pay that price. The federal courthouse in Seattle smelled like old wood and broken promises. Kieran sat at the defendant's table wearing an orange jumpsuit that felt like admission before the trial even started. His lawyer, a public defender named Chen, who looked barely 30 and perpetually exhausted, shuffled papers beside him while the gallery filled with journalists, federal prosecutors, and survivors from the North Star Dominion who'd come to watch the man who saved them get destroyed by the system he'd tried to expose. Judge Patricia Harmon entered, an older woman with iron gray hair and eyes that had seen every variation of human failure. She sat, arranged her robes, and studied Kieran like he was evidence in a crime scene photograph. "Mr. Valecroft, you stand accused of maritime piracy, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, unlawful boarding of an international vessel, assault on crew members, and obstruction of federal investigation. How do you plead?" Kieran stood. His voice came out steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Guilty, Your Honor, to everything." The gallery erupted, journalists typing furiously, prosecutors exchanging surprised glances. Chen grabbing Kieran's arm and hissing, "What are you doing?" into his ear. Judge Harmon's gavel came down like a gunshot. Order. Mr. Valecroft, do you understand that by pleading guilty, you waive your right to trial and place yourself entirely at the mercy of this court for sentencing? Yes, Your Honor. And your counsel has explained the potential penalties, 20 years federal prison for the piracy charge alone? He has. Chen was still pulling at his sleeve, but Kieran shook him off. This wasn't about legal strategy. This was about something Chen's law school education couldn't comprehend. The difference between being found guilty and choosing guilt. Between having shame imposed and claiming it voluntarily. Very well, Judge Harmon said. Given the unusual circumstances of this case and the public interest involved, I'm ordering a full presentencing investigation. We'll reconvene in 6 weeks for sentencing. Until then, Mr. Valecroft, you'll remain in federal custody. Bail denied. The gavel fell again. Guards moved in to escort Kieran back to holding. As they led him past the gallery, he locked eyes with Celine sitting in the third row. She gave him the smallest nod. Not approval, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement that he'd taken the first real step toward accountability. But beside her sat someone Kieran hadn't expected to see. Agent Naomi Mercer, dressed in civilian clothes, her badge conspicuously absent. Their eyes met for half a second before the guards pulled Kieran through the doors into the corridor that led back to his cell. But in that brief moment, he saw something in Mercer's expression that made his pulse spike. She had a plan. The Federal Detention Center was a concrete fortress in South Seattle, designed to make hope obsolete. Kieran spent the next 2 weeks in a 6x8 cell with a college kid arrested for hacking Pentagon servers and a former accountant who'd embezzled $4 million from a charity. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? They'd all betrayed something, and now they were living with it. On day 16, Kieran was pulled from the cell and brought to a windowless interview room where Mercer sat alone at a metal table with a file folder and 2 cups of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. "You look terrible," she said. "Federal custody agrees with me." "Sit down." Kieran sat. The guard stepped outside but remained visible through the reinforced glass window. Mercer waited until they'd stopped paying attention, then leaned forward. Damian Voss died this morning. Internal bleeding from the gunshot wound. Doctors tried to stabilize him, but his organs shut down. Kieran felt nothing. He'd spent 2 weeks imagining this moment, the death of the man who'd orchestrated so much suffering, and discovering it meant absolutely nothing changed the fundamental equation. Damian was one piece. The machine kept running without him. "What about Thorne?" Kieran asked. "Gone. Vanished completely. We raided properties in the Caymans, Switzerland, Singapore, always one step behind. He's got resources we can't track and connections we can't penetrate. So he wins." "Not if we stop playing by rules," he wrote. Mercer opened the folder. Inside were photographs. Surveillance images of Lucian Thorne in various locations over the past 2 weeks. Private yacht. Luxury hotel in Monaco. Art gallery in Dubai. Always moving. Always visible, but untouchable. "Official channels have failed," Mercer said. "Every warrant gets buried. Every extradition request denied. The man has protection at levels I can't even identify. But he's also arrogant. He wants people to know he's out there, that he survived, that the system can't touch him." "Where's this going?" Mercer pulled out another photograph. This one showed Thorne standing on a private airfield beside a Gulfstream jet, shaking hands with someone Kieran didn't recognize. 3 days from now, Thorne is attending a private auction in Reykjavik. High-end art and antiquities. Very exclusive. The kind of event where billionaires who want to stay off official radar conduct business. He'll be there for approximately 6 hours before flying to his next location. "And you want me to do what exactly?" "I'm in federal custody awaiting sentencing. Not if you're released into a special monitoring program. I've arranged it. You wear an ankle monitor, report daily, cooperate with ongoing investigations. Technically legal. Practically, it gives you 48 hours of freedom." Kieran stared at her. "You're asking me to violate the terms of my pretrial release to hunt down a man in Iceland? I'm telling you that I can get you to Reykjavik with equipment and support. What happens when you find Thorne is up to you." "This is insane. You're a federal agent." "Not anymore." Mercer reached into her jacket and pulled out her badge and credentials. She set them on the table between them. "I resigned this morning, effective immediately. Everything I'm doing now is as a private citizen. Why? Because I've spent 6 years watching the system protect the guilty and punish people who try to expose them. Because those 41 survivors deserve better than watching their trafficker give interviews on CNN. Because sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to become one yourself. She stood. You have 2 hours to decide. If you're in, Adrian Locke and his team are already en route to Iceland. Celine's with them. If you're out, you go back to your cell and wait for a judge to decide how much of your life you spend in prison. And if I agree? If we find Thorne? What then? Then we make sure he faces consequences the law couldn't deliver. You're talking about murder. Mercer's expression didn't change. I'm talking about justice. The difference is smaller than you think. She left the folder on the table and walked out. Kieran sat alone staring at the photographs of Lucian Thorne, smiling, confident, untouchable. He thought about the containers on the North Star Dominion, about Celine's blood on his kitchen floor, about the 41 people who'd survived and the thousands who hadn't, about the cage that still stood. 2 hours later, Kieran told the guards he'd made his decision. The flight to Reykjavik took 14 hours with a layover in Boston. Kieran traveled with forged credentials, identifying him as a consultant for an international security firm, his ankle monitor removed by someone in Mercer's network who knew how to bypass federal tracking systems. Every minute felt like waiting for sirens, for agents to storm the plane and drag him back to custody. But they didn't. He landed in Iceland at dawn to find Adrian waiting in the terminal holding a coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd seen too many operations go sideways. You look like hell, Adrian said. Everyone keeps saying that. Because it's true. Come on. We've got 12 hours before Thorne arrives. They drove through Reykjavik in a rental SUV, the city still half asleep, volcanic mountains visible in the distance beneath clouds that looked like smoke. Adrian explained the plan while navigating narrow streets lined with colorful houses that seemed too cheerful for what they were about to do. The auction is at a private estate 40 kilometers outside the city. Invitation only. Security will be extensive, but focused on preventing theft, not assault. Thorne will arrive by helicopter, stay for the auction, then leave. Our window is approximately 90 minutes between arrival and departure. And we're just going to walk in? Celine's handling that part. She's already on site working catering under a false identity. She'll get us inside through the service entrance. They pulled into a warehouse district on the outskirts of town. Inside one of the buildings, Yara had set up a command center. Laptops, monitors, communication equipment spread across folding tables. Marcus was checking weapons. Nate was organizing medical supplies. And Celine stood in the corner wearing a server's uniform, her face pale but determined. You came, she said when she saw Kieran. I'm an idiot. Yes, but you're here. She handed him an earpiece. Communications. Stay on channel 3. When Thorne arrives, I'll guide you to his location. After that, it's your move. Kieran took the earpiece. What if he has bodyguards? He will. 4 minimum, probably 6. All former military or intelligence. They'll be armed and extremely good at their job. So this is suicide. Adrian stepped forward. It's a tactical operation with significant risk factors, but we've planned for contingencies. Marcus will create a diversion at the north entrance. Yara's hacking their security feeds to create blind spots. Nate staged emergency medical equipment near the service road in case things go wrong. And if they do go wrong, then we improvise. But Kieran, understand something. This isn't a rescue mission. This is a targeted operation against a specific individual who has resources and protection beyond anything we've faced. Once we commit, there's no extraction plan. We either succeed or we die trying. The words should have terrified him. Instead, Kieran felt something close to relief. No more legal maneuvering, no more hoping the system would function, just a simple, brutal objective and the will to see it through. I'm in, he said. They spent the next hours reviewing blueprints of the estate, memorizing guard rotations, identifying escape routes that probably wouldn't work, but were better than nothing. Celine left first, driving to the estate in a catering van to establish her cover. The rest of them waited until dusk, then loaded into 2 vehicles, Adrian, Kieran, and Marcus in one, Yara and Nate in the other. The estate sat on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic, a modern structure of glass and steel that looked like it had been designed by someone who equated wealth with isolation. They parked a kilometer away and hiked through volcanic rock formations toward the service entrance, the wind cutting through their tactical gear like it was trying to strip them down to bone. Celine's voice crackled through the earpiece. I'm in position. Security sweep just passed. You've got 3 minutes to reach the service door. They moved fast, staying low, using the landscape for cover. The service entrance was a reinforced door with a keypad lock. Marcus pulled out a bypass device and went to work while Kieran kept watch, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. The lock clicked. The door swung open. They slipped inside into a corridor lined with stainless steel, kitchen prep area, staff changing rooms, storage. The auction was happening in the main gallery 3 floors up. Celine appeared from around a corner carrying a tray of champagne glasses. Thorne arrived 10 minutes ago. 3rd floor, east wing. He's viewing a private collection before the main auction starts. 2 bodyguards with him, 4 more positioned at exits. Where's the collection? Adrian asked. Follow me. She led them through the service corridors to a stairwell. They climbed in silence, each floor taking them deeper into enemy territory. At the 3rd floor landing, Celine stopped. Through that door is a hallway. East wing is at the end. The room Thorne's in has 1 entrance. His bodyguards are posted outside. There's no good approach. Then we make our own, Marcus said. He pulled out a small explosive charge, barely enough to blow a lock, but loud enough to create confusion. I set this on the north stairwell. When it goes off, security will converge on that location. You'll have maybe 90 seconds before they realize it's a diversion. Adrian nodded. Kieran, you're with me. We go in fast, neutralize the bodyguards, and confront Thorne. Celine, you stay here and guide us out when it's done. No, Celine said. I'm coming with you. You're still injured. I'm coming with you. There wasn't time to argue. Marcus disappeared to plant his charge. The rest of them waited in the stairwell, breathing steady, checking weapons, preparing for violence that would erupt in seconds. The explosion when it came was muffled but distinct. A thump that rattled the building and triggered immediate chaos. Footsteps running, radio chatter, alarms. Now, Adrian said. They burst through the door into the hallway. The 2 bodyguards outside Thorne's room turned, hands moving to weapons, but Adrian was faster. 2 shots from a suppressed pistol, and both men dropped before they could draw. Kieran kicked open the door. Lucian Thorne stood in the center of a private gallery surrounded by paintings worth millions, holding a glass of wine, looking completely unsurprised to see them. Mr. Valecroft, he said calmly, I was wondering when you'd arrive. Adrian swept the room with his weapon. No other guards, no obvious threats. Just Thorne and his wine and art that had probably been stolen from people who died trying to protect it. On your knees, Adrian commanded. Thorne took a sip of wine. No. I will shoot you. No, you won't. Because the moment you pull that trigger, every security team in this building converges on this location and kills you all. But more importantly, you won't shoot because you need something from me. Information. Connections. The locations of other operations. You're not here to kill me. You're here to break me. He set down the wine glass and looked directly at Kieran. You think I'm afraid of you? You think showing up with guns and stolen federal credentials changes anything? I've been hunted by people far more capable than you. I've survived investigations by agencies with resources you can't imagine. What makes you think this ends differently? Kieran stepped forward. His hands were steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Because I'm not trying to arrest you. I'm not trying to expose you. I'm just trying to stop you. Then you failed. I've already moved operations to new locations, established new networks. The ship you intercepted was 1 vessel in a fleet of dozens. The survivors you rescued represent a fraction of the people currently in transit. You saved 41 lives and congratulated yourself while thousands more disappeared into the machine. So tell me, Kieran, how exactly have you stopped anything? Celine moved past Adrian, her face twisted with rage. You're going to give us every location, every name, every route, or we broadcast your confession to every media outlet on the planet. Thorne laughed. Confess to what? You have no evidence linking me to anything. The North Star Dominion was operated by Damien Voss, now conveniently dead. My foundation has donated millions to anti-trafficking organizations. I'm a victim of association with a criminal enterprise I was trying to expose from within. That's the story my lawyers have prepared, and it's airtight. We have the bodies of those prosecutors, Kieran said. We have forensic evidence. You have corpses found on a ship I don't own, operated by people I don't employ, in waters where I've never traveled. My legal team will argue I was investigating Voss independently and was about to report my findings when you staged your illegal raid. And who does the world believe? A respected philanthropist or a convicted felon who hijacked a cargo vessel? The truth of it hit Kieran like cold water. Thorne had already won this confrontation before it started. Every scenario, every angle, covered by lawyers and shell corporations, and the simple fact that wealth could purchase any narrative it wanted. Adrian's weapon stayed trained on Thorne's chest. Last chance. On your knees. Or what? You execute me in front of witnesses? Make me a martyr? Give my foundation a tragedy to rally around? Thorne spread his arms. Go ahead. Pull the trigger. See what happens. The seconds stretched. Adrian's finger on the trigger. Thorne standing defiant, calling a bluff he knew they couldn't answer. Then Celine pulled a phone from her pocket. You're right about one thing, she said quietly. We can't prove you operated that ship. Can't prove you ordered those murders. Can't prove any of the things you've done in ways a court would accept. She held up the phone, screen facing Thorne. But we can prove what you're about to do. On the screen was a live video feed, a warehouse somewhere dark and industrial. And inside, clearly visible, were shipping containers being loaded with people, children, teenagers, women, while men in tactical gear supervised the operation. Thorne's face went white. This is streaming right now to a private server, Celine continued. The warehouse is one of yours, purchased through a shell company, registered to your name in the Seychelles. The operation is happening as we speak, and in approximately 30 seconds, this feed goes live on every social media platform simultaneously. Not evidence a lawyer can dismiss, not testimony that can be discredited, just raw footage of your network in operation. That's impossible. I shut down that location. He stopped, realizing what he'd just admitted. Celine smiled without humor. You shut it down. Your words, your knowledge, your operation. Thanks for the confession. Thorne lunged for the phone, but Adrian intercepted him, slamming him against the wall hard enough to crack plaster. Paintings fell. Wine glasses shattered. The door burst open and security flooded in, 4 armed men taking in the scene and immediately raising weapons. Drop it, one of them shouted. Adrian didn't move. His weapon stayed pressed against Thorne's head. Tell them to stand down, Adrian said quietly, or the feed goes live and your entire empire burns before morning. Thorne's breath came in ragged gasps, sweat on his forehead, the calm facade finally cracking to reveal something desperate underneath. Stand down, he whispered, louder. Stand down, all of you, lower your weapons. The security team hesitated, looking at each other, trying to process orders that contradicted their training. Do it! Thorne screamed. They lowered their weapons slowly, still ready to raise them again at the first wrong move. Kieran stepped forward, taking the phone from Celine. On the screen, the warehouse operation continued, people being moved like inventory, the horror documented in real time. Here's what happens next, Kieran said. You're going to write down every location, every name, every route your network uses. You're going to give us access codes to your servers. And you're going to transfer control of your shipping terminals to an international oversight committee. Do that, and we delete this feed. Refuse, and it goes live in 20 seconds. You're bluffing. That would destroy legitimate operations, cost thousands of jobs. 19 seconds. I have diplomatic immunity in 12 countries. You can't. 18 seconds. Thorne looked around the room at the security team that couldn't help him, at Adrian's weapon still pressed against his skull, at Celine watching him with eyes that held 15 years of survival and rage. 17 seconds. All right, Thorne's voice broke. All right, I'll give you what you want. 16 seconds. Say it clearly. I'll write down the locations. I'll give you the access codes. Just delete that feed. Kieran's thumb hovered over the screen. Every location, every name, complete cooperation, and you sign a confession admitting your role in the trafficking network. That's suicide. I'll spend the rest of my life in prison. 15 seconds. Thorne's face twisted with hate and desperation. Fine. Yes. I'll sign it. I'll give you everything. Just delete the feed. Kieran looked at Celine. She nodded once, confirmation that they had recording devices running, that every word Thorne just said was captured and admissible. Then Kieran pressed delete. The feed went dark. Thorne sagged against the wall, breathing like he'd just run a marathon. You have what you wanted. Now let me go. No, Kieran said. Now you write. They moved to a desk in the corner of the gallery. Thorne sat, trembling, and began writing with a pen that shook in his fingers. Locations, names, access codes, everything he'd spent 15 years building, spilling onto paper in handwriting that got more erratic with each line. Adrian and the security team maintained their standoff. Marcus appeared in the doorway, signaling that their exit route was still clear. Yara confirmed through the earpiece that she had the confession recording uploaded to multiple secure servers. After 20 minutes, Thorne finished writing. 8 pages of information that would dismantle a global trafficking empire. He pushed the papers toward Kieran. "There, everything. Now we're done." "Not quite," Celine said. She pulled out another phone, this one showing a different video feed. "That warehouse operation you shut down? It's not actually happening. The feed was pre-recorded footage from a location we raided 2 weeks ago. We edited the timestamp and made it look live." Thorne's eyes widened. "What? But your confession to shutting it down, that was real. That was you admitting knowledge and control over a trafficking operation. And that's now evidence in 17 different criminal investigations across 9 countries." The color drained from Thorne's face. You tricked me. "We gave you enough rope to hang yourself," Kieran said. "Everything you just admitted, everything you just wrote, it's all real. The only lie was the threat. The operation exists. You really did shut it down. You really do control those locations. You just didn't realize we already had proof from other sources. We just needed you to confirm it." Thorne stood, knocking the chair backward. "This is entrapment. It won't hold up in court." "We're not cops," Adrian said flatly. "We're not bound by rules of evidence. And the confession you just signed? We're sending it to every prosecutor, journalist, and advocacy group on the planet. You'll spend the rest of your life fighting extradition requests and criminal charges in jurisdictions that don't care about your diplomatic immunity." The security team leader stepped forward. "Mr. Thorne, we need to evacuate. Police are responding to the explosion. If we don't leave now..." "Go," Thorne said quietly. "All of you, get out." "Sir, I said go." The security team retreated, looking confused and angry, but ultimately following orders. The room emptied until only Kieran, Adrian, Celine, and Thorne remained. Thorne walked to the window overlooking the Atlantic. Waves crashed against rocks far below. The sun was setting, turning everything blood red. "You think you've won," he said, without turning around. "You think exposing me changes anything, but I'm one person. The network exists because people want it to exist, because there's demand for labor that can't complain about conditions, for services that require discretion, for profit margins that only make sense when you treat humans like commodities." He turned to face them. "I'll go to prison. My foundation will collapse. My name will become synonymous with evil. And within 6 months, someone else will rebuild what I destroyed. Different faces, different companies, same machine. Because the machine isn't sustained by bad people. It's sustained by everyone who benefits from cheap labor and turns away when they see the cost." "Maybe," Kieran said, "but you won't be part of it. Neither will you. You're going to prison too. And when you get out, if you get out, you'll discover that nothing fundamental has changed. You'll have saved some people, destroyed a few operations, felt righteous and noble, and the world will keep turning exactly as it always has." Sirens wailed in the distance, police converging on the estate. Adrian grabbed Kieran's arm. "We need to move. Now." But Kieran stayed rooted, staring at Thorne, seeing not a monster, but something worse. A mirror reflecting every choice he'd made 15 years ago, every signature he'd written without looking, every moment he'd chosen comfort over conscience. "You're right," Kieran said quietly. "I can't change the world. Can't stop the machine. Can't save everyone. But I can make sure you don't hurt anyone else. And that has to be enough. It won't be. Then I'll live with that too." They left Thorne standing alone in the gallery, surrounded by stolen art and broken illusions. Celine guided them through service corridors to the exit where Marcus waited with the vehicle already running. They piled in and drove toward Reykjavik, while behind them police lights strobed against the darkening sky. Nobody spoke during the drive. What was there to say? They'd gotten what they came for, a confession, evidence, the destruction of one man's empire. But Thorne's words hung in the air like smoke they couldn't clear. The machine would rebuild. Someone else would take his place. The fight would never truly end. They reached a safe house on the outskirts of the city, a small apartment Mercer had arranged through connections Kieran didn't want to examine too closely. Yara was already there, monitors showing news coverage of the developing story. Lucienne Thorne arrested at an Icelandic estate, international trafficking network exposed, diplomatic crisis brewing as countries scrambled to respond. Mercer appeared on one of the screens via video call, her expression unreadable. "You got him," she said. "We got him," Kieran confirmed. "The confession is solid. The evidence is overwhelming. Even with the best lawyers in the world, Thorne's looking at life in prison across multiple jurisdictions. And the survivors? The ones still in transit? Interpol is coordinating raids on 17 locations based on the information Thorne provided. Early estimates suggest over 200 people will be recovered within 48 hours. 200 lives. It should have felt like victory. Instead, Kieran felt hollow. "What happens now?" Celine asked. Mercer's image flickered. "Now comes the hard part. Thorne's arrest is triggering panic throughout the network. People are destroying evidence, fleeing jurisdictions, making deals with prosecutors. It's going to be chaos for months, maybe years." "And Kieran's charges?" "That's complicated. Technically, he violated the terms of his release. The judge could add years to his sentence. But given his cooperation in this operation and the results achieved, I'm recommending a deal. 5 years supervised probation, no prison time, in exchange for continued testimony against everyone connected to the network." Kieran looked at Celine. She met his eyes with an expression he couldn't read. "Take it," she said. "You're sure? You can't dismantle this machine from inside a cell. You need to be out here fighting, testifying, making sure every person Thorne named faces consequences." The screen flickered again. Mercer leaned closer to her camera. "There's something else. We found files in Thorne's servers, names of victims dating back 20 years, thousands of them. People who disappeared into the system and were never recovered." She paused, her expression grim. "Your name was on the list, Celine, as were records of every transaction, every movement, every person who handled you during your 6 years in captivity, including—" She trailed off. "Including what?" Celine demanded. "Including officials who were supposed to help you during the rescue operation that freed you. Social workers, immigration officers, people who were paid to redirect survivors back into the network instead of to safety. You were lucky. You got through, but others didn't." Celine's face went pale. "Who?" "Names are in the files, if you want them." "I want them." The call ended. The safe house fell silent except for the sound of wind outside and distant traffic and the weight of knowledge that grew heavier the more you carried it. Adrian stood. "I'm out. This operation is over. Thorne's captured. The confession is solid. Anything beyond this point isn't tactical. It's revenge. And I don't do revenge." He looked at Kieran. "You saved lives tonight. Don't waste that by chasing ghosts." He left. Marcus and Nate followed, disappearing into the Icelandic night, professionals returning to whatever shadows they'd emerged from. Only Yara remained, still monitoring the news feeds, watching the story spread across global media like wildfire. Kieran sat down beside Celine. She was staring at nothing, processing the revelation that the people who were supposed to save her had been part of the system that enslaved her. "I'm sorry," Kieran said. "Don't be. I knew the system was broken. Now I know exactly where the fractures are." "What are you going to do?" She turned to look at him. "Same thing you're doing. Fight until there's nothing left to fight with." The news coverage continued. Thorne's image plastered across every screen. Analysts debating the implications. Politicians scrambling to distance themselves from anyone connected to his foundation. And somewhere in all that noise, Kieran heard what Thorne had said in the gallery. The machine would rebuild. But for tonight, just for tonight, it was damaged. And that had to be enough. Kieran's phone buzzed, message from an unknown number. He opened it. A single line of text. "The cage still stands, but you made it smaller. A friend." No signature, no indication who sent it. But somehow, Kieran knew. Someone else fighting the same war. Someone else who understood that victory wasn't measured in battles won, but in the distance between one atrocity and the next. He showed the message to Celine. She read it and nodded slowly. "Then we keep fighting." "Until when?" "Until the cage breaks, or we do." Outside, dawn was beginning to break over Reykjavik, turning the volcanic landscape from black to gray to gold. Somewhere in the world, shipping containers were being loaded with people who didn't deserve the suffering waiting for them. Somewhere, prosecutors were filing charges against people whose names appeared in Thorne's confession. Somewhere, survivors were waking up in facilities that would try to help them rebuild lives the system had tried to erase. And somewhere in Seattle, a federal judge was reviewing a plea deal for a billionaire who'd committed crimes to stop crimes and would spend the rest of his life trying to figure out if that made him a criminal or a hero. The answer, Kieran suspected, was both. And neither. And something far more complicated than any courtroom could adjudicate. He looked at Celine, the woman who'd survived impossible things and refused to let that survival be the end of her story. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Home to what? Prison? Probation? A life spent testifying in trials that'll take years to complete? Yeah, that. She smiled, not with happiness, but with the grim determination of someone who'd chosen a fight, knowing it would consume them. Let's go. They left the safe house as Reykjavik woke around them, the city indifferent to the battle that had just been fought in its shadows. The flight back to Seattle would take 14 hours. The fight would take the rest of their lives. And for the first time since finding Celine bleeding on his kitchen floor, Kieran understood that redemption wasn't about being forgiven. It was about choosing to be accountable every single day after innocence was already gone. The plane lifted into gray morning sky. Below them, Iceland receded into memory. Ahead, America waited with handcuffs and consequences, and the long, grinding machinery of justice that would try to measure what they'd done against what they'd destroyed. Kieran closed his eyes and let exhaustion finally win. When he woke, they'd be landing in a country that didn't know quite what to do with people who broke laws to enforce them. But for now, suspended between sky and earth, he allowed himself one small moment of peace. 41 survivors, 200 more on the way to rescue, one monster facing justice. The cage still stood, but it was smaller than yesterday, and tomorrow they'd make it smaller still, until nothing remained but the memory of suffering and the determination to never let it happen again. The engines hummed, the world turned, and Kieran Valecroft flew toward whatever came next, finally unafraid to face it. The plane touched down at SeaTac International at 4 in the afternoon, under a sky the color of old bruises. Kieran walked through the terminal flanked by federal marshals who'd been waiting at the gate, their faces professionally neutral as they escorted him past travelers who stopped and stared, some recognizing him from news coverage, others just sensing that something significant was happening in their ordinary Monday. Celine walked separately, technically a witness rather than a defendant, though the distinction felt arbitrary given everything they'd done together. She met Kieran's eyes once as the marshals guided him toward a security corridor, and in that brief glance he saw acknowledgement that this was where their paths diverged, at least for now. The federal courthouse basement held processing rooms that smelled like industrial cleaner and the accumulated anxiety of everyone who'd passed through them. They took Kieran's belongings, photographed him again, even though they already had a dozen images on file, and placed him in a holding cell that was identical to every other cell he'd occupied over the past month. Same metal bench, same fluorescent lights that made everything look sickly, same sense that time had stopped meaning anything beyond the space between one hearing and the next. Chen appeared 2 hours later looking even more exhausted than before, if that was possible. He sat across from Kieran in an interview room with files spread between them like evidence at a crime scene. "The judge is furious," Chen said without preamble. "You violated release conditions, left the country using false credentials, participated in what Iceland is calling an unlawful detention of a foreign national on their soil. The prosecution wants to throw the book at you, 20 years minimum." But Agent Mercer's testimony changes the equation. She's claiming she recruited you for an unsanctioned operation that resulted in the arrest of Lucian Thorne and the exposure of an international trafficking network. The Bureau is scrambling to distance itself from her actions while simultaneously taking credit for the results. It's a mess. What's the deal? Chen pulled out a document. Prosecutors offering 7 years federal prison. You serve minimum 5 with good behavior. In exchange, you provide testimony in every case connected to Thorne's network. No probation, no monitoring, just straight time and cooperation. Kieran stared at the paper. 7 years. He'd be 53 when he got out. Everything he'd built would be gone. The company dissolved, assets seized, reputation destroyed beyond any possibility of rehabilitation. What if I fight it? Then you risk 20. And honestly, Kieran, the evidence against you is overwhelming. You're on camera boarding that ship. You confessed in open court. The Iceland operation gives prosecutors ammunition to argue you're a flight risk and a danger to international relations. You go to trial, you lose. And the survivors, the people we rescued, safe, in processing. Most will receive asylum or protected status. Their testimonies are being used to build cases against everyone named in Thorne's confession. You did that. Whatever else happens, you saved those lives. Kieran picked up the pen Chen offered. His hand hovered over the signature line. Before I sign, I need to know something. Thorne, is he actually going to face consequences, or is this another performance where money buys him a way out? Chen pulled up something on his tablet and turned it toward Kieran. News footage from earlier that day showed Lucian Thorne being transferred from Icelandic custody to international authorities. His hands bound, his expensive suit rumpled, cameras capturing every moment of his humiliation. He's being charged in 17 countries, Chen said. Iceland, United States, Philippines, Thailand, Nigeria, Poland, everywhere his network operated. Even if he beats charges in one jurisdiction, he'll be extradited to another. His lawyers are already arguing about which country gets him first. He'll spend the rest of his life in courtrooms and prisons. There's no escape this time. Kieran watched the footage loop. Thorne being led through an airport in handcuffs. Thorne being photographed for a mugshot. Thorne sitting alone in a cell probably very similar to the one Kieran currently occupied. The machine hadn't been destroyed, but one of its architects was finally facing the consequences he'd spent decades avoiding. Kieran signed the document. 7 years, he said. When do I start? Sentencing is scheduled for next week. Judge Harmon will make it official. Until then, you're remanded to federal custody. Chen gathered his files. At the door, he paused. For what it's worth, I think what you did was reckless and illegal and completely necessary. The system failed those people. You didn't. That should count for something. Does it? In here? Chen gestured at the courthouse around them. No, but out there where it matters? Maybe. He left. Kieran sat alone in the interview room, staring at his signature on the plea agreement, wondering if he'd just signed away 7 years of his life, or finally started paying a debt he'd accumulated over 50. The week before sentencing passed in a blur of depositions and testimony. Prosecutors from multiple jurisdictions came to interview Kieran about his involvement 15 years ago, his knowledge of Damien Voss's operations, his interactions with Lucian Thorne. Every question peeled back another layer of the past he'd tried to bury, forcing him to recount specific moments, signing manifests, processing payments, standing in warehouses while human suffering happened in containers he pretended not to see. Celine testified too, though separately. Kieran only saw her once during that week, passing in a courthouse hallway while both were being escorted by federal agents. She looked thinner, paler, like the Iceland operation had cost her something she couldn't quite replenish. But her eyes were still fierce, still burning with the determination that had carried her through 6 years of captivity and 9 months of infiltrating his life. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said in cargo holds and safe houses and moments of violence that had bound them together in ways neither fully understood. The sentencing hearing took place on a Thursday morning before a packed courtroom. Judge Harmon entered looking severe and disappointed, the expression of someone who'd seen too many promising futures destroyed by greed and cowardice. Mr. Valecroft, please rise. Kieran stood, Chen beside him, hands clasped professionally, face neutral. Judge Harmon read from prepared remarks, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. You have pleaded guilty to multiple federal crimes, including maritime piracy, conspiracy, and violation of international law. These are serious charges that normally carry significant prison sentences. However, the circumstances of your case are unusual. She paused, looking directly at Kieran. You committed crimes to stop other crimes. You violated the law to expose systematic violations that were protected by corruption at multiple levels of government and industry. This court does not condone vigilantism. We cannot allow individuals to take justice into their own hands regardless of their motivations. However, we must also acknowledge that your actions resulted in the rescue of dozens of trafficking survivors and the exposure of a network that has operated with impunity for over a decade. She consulted her notes. I've reviewed testimony from survivors who credit you with saving their lives. I've read statements from federal investigators who acknowledge that without your cooperation, Lucian Thorne would likely still be operating freely. I've considered the argument that punishing you harshly would send a message that the system prioritizes its own authority over the welfare of victims. Another pause. Longer this time. Nevertheless, you broke the law. You boarded a vessel in international waters. You engaged in actions that could have resulted in deaths. You fled the country while under court supervision. These actions have consequences. Judge Harmon looked down at the sentencing guidelines, then back at Kieran. I am accepting your plea agreement. 7 years federal prison. However, I am recommending you serve that sentence at a facility that allows for continued cooperation with ongoing investigations and access to programs for rehabilitation and trauma counseling. This is not leniency, Mr. Valecroft. This is recognition that broken people who try to fix what they've broken deserve a different kind of justice than those who simply profit from destruction. The gavel came down. 7 years. The marshals moved in to take him away. As they led Kieran out of the courtroom, he looked back one last time. Celine sat in the gallery, tears on her face, but not crying, just letting them fall like rain she'd learned to endure without seeking shelter. Their eyes met across the distance. She nodded once, a gesture that meant goodbye or good luck, or simply acknowledgement that they'd survived this far and would both keep surviving whatever came next. Then Kieran was through the doors and the courtroom was gone, and the future collapsed down to the dimensions of a prison cell that would be his home for the next 5 to 7 years. The federal correctional facility in Oregon was called Sheridan, and it sat among farmland that stretched toward mountains visible on clear days. Kieran arrived in chains, processed through intake with men who'd committed fraud and drug trafficking and violent crimes that had nothing to do with redemption or trafficking or trying to fix what they'd broken. His cell was 6 by 8 feet with a metal bunk, a toilet, and a window too high to see out of properly. His cellmate was a former accountant named Rodriguez, who'd embezzled money from a nonprofit and spent his days reading legal briefs and filing appeals that went nowhere. They didn't talk much. What was there to discuss? Both had made choices that led here. Both were living with consequences. The days fell into routine. Wake at 6. Breakfast in a cafeteria that smelled like industrial food and desperation. Work detail in the prison library where Kieran shelved books and tried not to think about the empire he'd built and lost. Lunch. Afternoon in the yard where men lifted weights or played basketball or just stood against the fence staring at mountains and freedom they couldn't reach. Dinner. Evening count. Lights out at 10. Weeks became months. Kieran gave depositions via video link to prosecutors building cases against everyone named in Thorne's confession. He testified about shipping routes and financial transactions and the coded language used to discuss human cargo without ever explicitly acknowledging what was being transported. Each session meant reliving his complicity, describing in detail the moments when he could have said something and chose silence instead. Letters arrived from Celine. She never visited, said she couldn't bear seeing him behind bars, but she wrote every week describing her work with survivor advocacy organizations. She'd become a public face for trafficking awareness, speaking at conferences, training law enforcement, helping survivors navigate systems designed to process them rather than help them. Her words were matter of fact, devoid of emotion, just facts about lives saved and programs implemented and the slow grinding work of building something better from the wreckage. Kieran wrote back when he could find words that felt adequate. Mostly he failed. What could he say that mattered? That he was sorry? That he was trying to be better? Words felt hollow compared to the 7 years he was serving, and even 7 years felt hollow compared to what survivors had endured. On his 40th birthday, Kieran received a letter from someone he didn't expect. Adrian Locke. The handwriting was rough, the message brief. You did the right thing for the wrong reasons and paid the wrong price for doing right. That's more than most people manage. Keep your head down. The fight's still happening out here, and some of us are still in it. Kieran read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and kept it under his mattress with Celine's letters and the few photographs he was allowed to keep. Images of the survivors from the North Star Dominion reuniting with families, starting new lives, existing as proof that the operation had meant something beyond his own destruction. 2 years into his sentence, news broke that Lucian Thorne had been convicted in a Philippine court of human trafficking, murder, and conspiracy, sentenced to life without parole. Similar verdicts followed in Thailand, Iceland, Nigeria. Each conviction meant another life sentence, another jurisdiction where Thorne would never again walk free. Kieran watched the news coverage in the prison common room, surrounded by men who didn't understand why this particular conviction mattered to him. He didn't explain, couldn't explain. Just sat there feeling something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was close. The knowledge that consequences had finally caught up with someone who'd spent decades outrunning them. That night, Rodriguez asked him quietly, "That guy they convicted, Thorne, you knew him?" "I helped build what he used to hurt people. And now you're here while he's there." "Yeah." "Does it feel like justice?" Kieran thought about it. About the survivors rebuilding lives. About Thorne spending the rest of his existence in cells progressively worse than the one Kieran occupied. About the network that had been damaged but not destroyed. About other operations already filling the vacuum left by Thorne's arrest. "No," he said finally. "It feels like the beginning of justice. The actual thing is going to take a lot longer." 3 years in, Kieran was moved to a minimum security facility with more privileges and less wire in the fences. He could work outside, tend gardens that supplied produce to the prison kitchen, feel sunlight on his skin for hours instead of minutes. The new facility had programs, therapy, education, job training for life after release. Kieran attended trauma counseling sessions led by a woman named Dr. Martinez, who'd worked with victims of violence for 20 years. She asked questions that peeled back layers he'd spent decades building. "When did you first realize what you were part of?" she asked during one session. "The moment I heard scratching inside a container and told myself it was nothing." "And when did you decide to act on that knowledge?" 15 years too late." "Why then? Why not never?" Kieran thought about Celine bleeding on his kitchen floor, about the note she'd left, about Damien's message forcing him to confront what he'd spent years pretending didn't exist. Because someone refused to let me forget what I'd done, and because the alternative was spending the rest of my life hiding from consequences that were coming anyway. Dr. Martinez nodded. "Accountability isn't about becoming innocent again. It's about choosing truth every day after innocence is gone. Can you do that?" "I'm trying. That's all any of us can do." In his 4th year, Kieran received word that the last major trial connected to Thorne's network had concluded. 17 defendants convicted across 9 countries, hundreds of trafficking victims identified and provided with services. Multiple shipping companies shut down or placed under international oversight. The machine hadn't been destroyed, but it had been wounded badly enough that rebuilding would take years and cost resources the remaining operators struggled to access. Celine's letters mentioned this as a victory, though a qualified one. The demand for trafficked labor still existed. The vulnerabilities that made people targets still existed. The corruption that protected operators still existed. But the specific network that had destroyed her childhood and killed thousands was shattered beyond immediate repair. That had to count for something. Kieran marked the anniversary of the North Star Dominion operation by writing letters to each of the 41 survivors whose addresses he'd been able to obtain through the advocacy organization Celine worked with. He didn't expect responses, didn't need them. Just wanted those people to know someone remembered what they'd survived and considered their continued existence a form of victory the machine couldn't erase. 3 wrote back. One was a young woman named Maria, who'd been 17 when they pulled her from the container, now 21 and studying nursing at a community college in California. She wrote, "I think about that night sometimes, how dark it was, how I thought we were all going to die. Then the door opened, and there was light and voices telling us we were safe. I didn't believe them at first. Took months before I stopped waiting for someone to lock me up again. But I'm here. I'm alive. I'm becoming someone who helps people instead of needing help. Thank you for being part of why that's possible." Kieran read that letter until the paper started to wear thin from handling, until the words were memorized, until they became something like absolution, even though he knew absolution wasn't his to claim. Year 5 arrived with the possibility of parole. The hearing was brief. prosecutors arguing he'd served sufficient time and cooperated extensively, defense counsel noting his exemplary behavior, and continued participation in victim advocacy from inside the facility. Judge Harmon, presiding over the parole decision via video link, granted release with conditions. 3 years supervised probation, monthly reporting to a federal officer, continued cooperation with any ongoing investigations, restrictions on international travel, a life circumscribed by consequences but no longer confined by walls. Kieran walked out of Sheridan Federal Correctional Facility on a morning that smelled like rain even though the sky was clear. He carried a duffel bag containing everything he owned, clothes, letters, the photographs of survivors he'd kept as reminders that some things couldn't be measured in cells or sentences. Celine was waiting in the parking lot. She looked older. They both did. 5 years had carved lines into faces that had been smooth when this started, had added gray to hair and weight to shoulders that came from carrying knowledge no one should have to bear. They stood 3 feet apart, neither quite knowing what to do with the space between them. "You came," Kieran said. "Where else would I be?" "Anywhere. You've built a whole life while I was inside. You don't owe me." "This isn't about owing. This is about finishing what we started." She pulled out a folder from her car and handed it to him. Inside were documents, incorporation papers for a nonprofit organization called Cage Breakers, dedicated to survivor support and trafficking prevention. Celine's name was listed as executive director. Kieran's name was listed as founding board member. "I can't," he said. "I'm a convicted felon. I'll damage your credibility. You're a survivor of your own complicity. You faced consequences. You spent 5 years paying a debt most people never acknowledge they owe. That makes you exactly the kind of person this organization needs." She opened the car door. "Get in. We've got work to do." Kieran climbed into the passenger seat, still holding the folder, still processing what she was offering. Not forgiveness, not redemption, but purpose. A way to keep fighting. They drove toward Seattle through landscape that looked the same as when he'd left it, but felt fundamentally different. Or maybe he was the one who'd changed. Maybe 5 years of being forced to sit with what he'd done had burned away the parts of himself that could look away from suffering. "What happened to Thorne?" Kieran asked. "Serving consecutive life sentences in a maximum security facility in Manila. No parole, no appeals left. He'll die in prison." "And Damien?" "Dead." "You knew that. Died from the gunshot wound complications." "I meant his network, the people he worked with." Celine's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Some went to prison. Some fled to countries without extradition. Some are still operating under different names. The work never ends, Kieran. You know that." "Yeah, I know." They reached the outskirts of Seattle as afternoon shifted toward evening, the city's skyline emerging from mist like a promise or a threat, depending on how you looked at it. Celine drove to an address in an industrial area south of downtown, a converted warehouse with the Cage Breakers logo painted on the side. Inside, the space had been transformed into offices, meeting rooms, and a resource center where survivors could access legal aid, counseling, job training, and housing assistance. A dozen people worked at desks or moved between rooms with the purposeful energy of people who'd found something worth dedicating their lives to. "This is what we built with the settlement money from seizing Thorne's assets," Celine said. "Every dollar he made from trafficking went into programs to help survivors rebuild. Every property he owned now houses people escaping exploitation. We turned his empire into exactly what he feared most, a system that empowers the people he tried to erase." She led Kieran through the facility, introducing him to staff members who nodded politely but kept their distance, clearly aware of his history and unsure how to reconcile the man who'd helped build the machine with the man who'd helped break it. In a conference room at the back, Adrian Locke sat reviewing security protocols with Yara and Marcus. They looked up when Kieran entered, expressions unreadable. "You're out," Adrian said. 5 years good behavior. Thought you'd get the full 7. Judge decided I'd suffered enough." Adrian stood, walked around the table, and extended his hand. "Then let's make sure that suffering meant something." They shook. The grip was firm, professional, but underneath it, Kieran felt something like acceptance, not of what he'd done, but of what he was trying to become. Over the next weeks, Kieran learned the scope of what Cage Breakers had accomplished in the 5 years since Thorne's arrest. They'd helped over 300 survivors access services, partnered with law enforcement in 12 countries to identify and shut down trafficking operations, trained thousands of frontline workers, hotel staff, truckers, medical personnel to recognize signs of exploitation. The work was relentless. For every operation they stopped, 3 more emerged. For every survivor they helped, dozens remained trapped in systems designed to make them invisible. But the victories, however small, mattered. Maria, the nursing student who'd written to Kieran in prison, joined the organization as a volunteer, using her experience to connect with newly rescued survivors in ways professionals never could. Others followed. People who'd survived containers and brothels and farms where they'd been worked like equipment became advocates and counselors, and living proof that the machine didn't get to write the final chapter. 6 months after his release, Kieran stood in front of a congressional committee investigating trafficking networks and their connections to legitimate businesses. He testified for 4 hours, describing in methodical detail how shipping companies, logistics firms, and charitable foundations provided cover for operations that treated humans as commodities. Senators asked questions, some hostile, suggesting he was exaggerating to minimize his own guilt. Others genuinely interested in understanding how such massive operations could exist without detection. Kieran answered every question with facts stripped of emotion, letting the data speak for itself. How many containers? How many victims? How much money? How many people in positions of authority who knew and looked away because it was easier or more profitable than intervening? When it was over, the committee chair, a senator from Minnesota who'd lost a constituent to trafficking 5 years earlier, thanked Kieran for his testimony and added something unexpected. You can't undo what you did. Can't give back the years those people lost. But you can make sure other people in your position understand that looking away has consequences. That silence is a choice. That complicity isn't passive. Thank you for choosing accountability, even if it came too late. Kieran left the Capitol building and walked through Washington, D.C. in the rain, letting the water soak through his jacket, feeling something like catharsis, but knowing it wasn't really that. Catharsis implied release. This was more like learning to carry weight without letting it crush him. Celine met him at the airport for his flight back to Seattle. She'd watched the testimony on C-SPAN from the Cagebreaker's office. "You did good," she said. "I told the truth. That's not the same as doing good. It's more than most people manage." They sat in the airport lounge waiting for boarding, surrounded by travelers who had no idea they were sitting near people who'd dismantled trafficking networks and served prison time and learned to live with consequences most people never faced. "Do you ever regret it?" Kieran asked. "Infiltrating my life, the knife, everything that followed." Celine considered the question. "I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret doing it. You were complicit in something monstrous. Someone needed to force you to see that. Would have preferred it happened 15 years earlier before more people got hurt, but I can't change when you were ready to face what you'd done. And now? Now we keep working, keep fighting, keep pulling people out of containers and helping them remember they're human. That's all there is." The boarding announcement came. They walked toward the gate together, 2 survivors of different kinds of trauma bound together by shared purpose, and the understanding that some fights never end. You just choose whether to keep showing up. The plane lifted into gray sky above D.C., banking west toward Seattle, and the warehouse that had become headquarters for a war against systems designed to erase people. Kieran looked down at the city shrinking below, monuments and government buildings, and the machinery of power that protected some people while abandoning others to fates they didn't deserve. He thought about the 41 survivors from the North Star Dominion, about Maria studying nursing and the others rebuilding lives piece by painful piece, thought about the hundreds more cage breakers had helped, and the thousands still trapped in containers and facilities and situations that would kill them or destroy them or both. The machine still stood, but it was smaller than yesterday, and tomorrow they'd make it smaller still. Years passed. Not smoothly. Nothing about the work was smooth, but steadily. Kieran testified in trials across 3 continents, helped draft legislation to close loopholes that allowed trafficking to hide behind legitimate commerce, spoke at universities and conferences about the seductive nature of complicity and the cost of silence. His probation ended. The ankle monitor came off. He was offered opportunities to rebuild his business empire, to leverage his notoriety into profitable consulting or speaking careers. He turned them all down. The warehouse in South Seattle, Cagebreaker's headquarters, was where he spent his days, working intake for new survivors, coordinating with law enforcement on active investigations, training volunteers, raising funds from donors who'd once attended his luxury galas and now supported something that actually mattered. On the 10th anniversary of the North Star Dominion operation, the organization held a memorial service for everyone who died in trafficking networks over the past decade. Thousands of names read aloud by survivors and advocates and family members who'd lost people to a machine that tried to make them disappear. Kieran stood in the back of the room listening to names that went on for hours, each one representing a life the system had failed to protect or save. When they reached names from the Tacoma operation 15 years ago, names extracted from files Thorne had kept as insurance, Kieran felt his throat close. These were the people whose suffering he'd enabled with signatures on manifests. These were the lives ended or destroyed while he collected paychecks and promotions and convinced himself logistics was just logistics. After the memorial, survivors gathered in smaller groups sharing stories and supporting each other through grief that never fully healed. Kieran found Maria standing near a window overlooking the harbor where ships moved silently through black water. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded without looking at him. "Just thinking about all the names we didn't read, the ones who disappeared so completely there's no record they existed." "Yeah. My sister was one of them, taken from the same village as me, but on a different night. I never found out what happened to her, never got to read her name in a memorial. She just vanished." Kieran didn't know what to say. There was nothing to say. Some losses couldn't be processed or healed or made meaningful through ceremony. "I'm sorry," he managed. "Don't be. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep making sure other people don't vanish. That has to be enough because it's all we've got." She walked away to join other survivors, leaving Kieran alone by the window, staring at ships that might be carrying legitimate cargo, or might be carrying people locked in containers hoping someone would find them before it was too late. Celine appeared beside him. She looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from years of fighting battles that never ended, victories that never felt complete, progress measured in inches while the machine measured its operations in miles. "You should go home," she said. "Get some rest." "Where's home?" It was a real question. After his release from prison, Kieran had moved into a small apartment near the warehouse. Sparse, functional, nothing like the waterfront mansion he'd lost to asset seizure. He owned almost nothing, lived simply, spent his money funding operations that saved lives instead of building monuments to wealth. "Home is wherever you sleep," Celine said, "as long as you wake up ready to keep fighting." They left the warehouse together, locking the doors behind them, standing in the parking lot as rain started falling the way it always did in Seattle. Steady, persistent, indifferent to human suffering or resilience. "Do you think we've made a difference?" Kieran asked. "In 10 years. All the testimony and trials and survivors helped. Has it actually changed anything fundamental?" Celine looked at the warehouse behind them, at the lights still on in windows where volunteers worked late, processing intake forms and coordinating with international partners. "We've saved lives, destroyed operations, held people accountable who thought they were untouchable. That's not changing the fundamental system. Demand for exploited labor still exists, vulnerabilities still exist, corruption still exists. But we've made it harder, more expensive, more dangerous for the operators. We've given survivors voices and platforms and proof that the machine doesn't get to write the ending." That's not an answer. It's the only answer there is. You want transformation? That takes generations. What we're doing is making sure there are generations, making sure enough people survive to build something better than what destroyed them. Thunder rolled across the harbor. Ships moved through darkness toward destinations they'd reach or not, depending on weather and currents and factors beyond anyone's control. Kieran thought about Lucien Thorne dying slowly in a Manila prison, about Damien Voss already dead and buried, about the network they'd built splintering into smaller operations run by people less competent and more desperate, making mistakes that got them caught or killed. The machine still stood, but it was damaged, compromised, operating at reduced capacity with increased risk. That had to count for something. "Come on," Celine said. "I'll drive you home." They got in her car, a practical sedan that had replaced the luxury vehicles from another lifetime. and drove through rain-slicked streets toward Kieran's apartment. The city looked different at night, all neon reflections and shadows where people slept or worked or suffered in ways invisible to those who chose not to see. At his building, Celine put the car in park but didn't turn off the engine. "You ever think about stopping?" Kieran asked. "Walking away from all this and trying to build a normal life?" "Every day." "What keeps you going?" "Same thing that keeps you going. The knowledge that if we stop, the machine wins. And I spent 6 years being crushed by that machine. I'm not giving it the satisfaction of breaking me now." She looked at him directly. "We're never going to be normal, Kieran. People who've seen what we've seen, done what we've done. Normal isn't an option anymore. Best we can hope for is purpose, something worth the cost of being unable to look away." "Is it worth it?" "Ask me in another 10 years. Kieran got out of the car and stood in the rain watching her drive away, taillights disappearing into the night. He climbed stairs to his third-floor apartment, unlocked the door, and entered a space that held almost nothing: a bed, a table, a laptop for work, photographs of survivors on the walls as reminders of why any of this mattered. He sat at the table and opened his laptop to email. 300 unread messages, requests for testimony, questions from survivors, updates from international partners. The work never stopped, because suffering never stopped, and the only choice was whether to engage with it or pretend it existed somewhere too distant to require response. Kieran worked until midnight answering emails, coordinating investigations, reviewing intake forms for new survivors who just escaped situations that would haunt them forever. Each message was a small piece of the larger fight, insufficient by itself, but part of an accumulated effort that might eventually add up to something like justice. At 1 a.m., exhaustion finally won. Kieran closed the laptop and lay down on his bed fully clothed, too tired to shower or change, too aware that tomorrow would bring the same relentless demands and the same insufficient responses. Before sleep took him, he thought about the scratching sound inside a container 15 years ago. The sound he'd pretended not to hear because hearing meant knowing, and knowing meant choosing, and choosing meant sacrificing comfort for consequence. He couldn't unhear it now, would never unhear it, would spend the rest of his life listening for scratching sounds and choosing to respond instead of looking away. The rain hammered windows, the city breathed around him, and somewhere in the Pacific, cargo ships moved through darkness carrying freight that was legitimate or monstrous depending on who was willing to check. Kieran closed his eyes and let exhaustion pull him under, knowing morning would come too soon and bring work that would never be finished and battles that would never be conclusively won, but also knowing that 41 people from the North Star Dominion were alive and building futures because he'd finally chosen to act. That Maria was becoming a nurse who would save lives instead of being a statistic who'd lost hers. That hundreds of survivors had passed through cage breakers and emerged with resources and support and the knowledge that they weren't alone. The cage still stood, but it was smaller, and every day they made it smaller still. That had to be enough, because it was all anyone could offer, not transformation, not redemption, not the erasure of past complicity, just the choice to keep choosing accountability over silence, to keep fighting even when the fight had no clear ending, to keep saving whoever could be saved and mourning whoever couldn't, and refusing to let the machine define the meaning of either. Outside, dawn was beginning to break over Seattle, turning the waterfront from black to gray to gold. Ships moved through the harbor. The world turned. And Kieran Valecroft, survivor of his own complicity, architect of his own consequences, fighter in a war that would outlive him, opened his eyes to another day of doing the only thing that mattered anymore: showing up, bearing witness, making the cage smaller, one life at a time, for as long as it took. The end.